At 2:47 in the morning, Ethan Caldwell picked up the phone to answer the fifth frantic call from his pregnant wife, then hurled it straight at the wall, shattering it into pieces, while Vanessa Reed lay beside him and laughed. He didn't ask if Olivia was safe. He didn't call her back. He poured himself another drink, raising his glass to toast a deal about to close the next morning, completely indifferent to the woman carrying his own child alone, sobbing 20 blocks away. By dawn, Olivia would vanish without a trace. By sunset, his billion-dollar empire would begin collapsing beneath his feet, and the mistress lying next to him would finally understand in horror exactly what kind of monster she had chosen. Before we continue, if you're new here, please hit subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. And down in the comments, tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I love seeing just how far this story travels. Ethan Caldwell did not believe in guilt. He had built his entire life on the principle that guilt was a tax paid only by people who couldn't afford to win, and Ethan had never lost anything he truly wanted. Not a deal, not a building, not a woman. So when he silenced Olivia's call that night, sliding the phone face down onto Vanessa's marble nightstand, he didn't feel the cold twist in his stomach that another man might have felt. He felt nothing at all. That was the part that would haunt him later, when he had all the time in the world to sit with it. Not what he did, but how easy it had been to do it. "She's calling again," Vanessa said, propped up on one elbow, her voice light, almost teasing the voice of a woman who had convinced herself she was untouchable too. "She does that," Ethan said. "Doesn't it bother you?" He looked at the phone, dark, now silent. "She's 7 months pregnant and bored. She wants to talk about paint colors for the nursery. I'll call her tomorrow." Vanessa laughed, and the sound of it filled the room, confident. Warm, the laugh of a woman who had spent 2 years believing she was winning something. She had no idea she was already losing. None of them did. Not yet. Across the city, in a penthouse that overlooked Central Park, Olivia Brooks Caldwell sat alone at the kitchen island, with her phone in her hand, watching the call ring out for the 4th time. She did not cry. She had done all her crying 3 weeks earlier in the private bathroom of her obstetrician's office after a phone call from a woman she had never met who claimed to be a business reporter and asked her very gently whether she was aware her husband had been seen leaving the Delancey Hotel with Vanessa Reed on 4 separate occasions in the last 2 months. Olivia had said nothing to the reporter. She had thanked her, hung up, and locked herself in that bathroom stall for 11 minutes, one hand pressed to her stomach, feeling her daughter kick as if the baby somehow understood that her mother's whole world had just been rearranged. 11 minutes. That was all Olivia allowed herself. After that, she didn't cry again. She planned. Tonight, she set the phone down on the counter beside a mug of chamomile tea that had gone cold an hour ago. She looked around the kitchen she had designed herself, the kitchen where she used to imagine feeding a toddler breakfast before school, and she whispered something to the empty room that no one heard. "Last night," she said. "One more night." She had no idea sitting there how true those words would turn out to be, or how much would change before the sun rose again. Ethan came home the next evening at 7 later than usual, smelling faintly of Vanessa's perfume, though he had showered at the office gym specifically to avoid that mistake. He was good at avoiding mistakes. He had built an empire on avoiding mistakes. He stepped off the private elevator into the penthouse foyer, loosening his tie, already composing in his head the apology he would give Olivia for missing her calls, already rehearsing the tired, patient tone he would use. The tone that said, "I'm a busy man, be reasonable." "Liv!" he called out. Silence answered him. He walked further in, past the living room, past the nursery door that stood slightly ajar. The one room in the apartment Olivia had poured herself into, completely painting the walls a soft, buttery yellow, because they hadn't wanted to know the gender hand-stenciling small birds along the ceiling, molding herself on a ladder 7 months pregnant, refusing his offer to hire someone. "I want to do it myself," she'd told him back then. "I want her to know her mother built this with her own hands." He hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now, standing in the hallway, he noticed the nursery door was open, and something about the quiet coming from inside it made the hair on his arms rise. "Olivia," he said again, sharper this time. Nothing. He checked the bedroom next. The bed was made untouched the way it looked when the housekeeper had just finished with it. Her side of the closet stood open, not ransacked, not chaotic, organized, deliberate, as if someone had taken exactly what they needed and left everything else in perfect order the way Olivia did everything. That was when he saw it. On the kitchen counter in the exact center of the marble island sat her wedding ring. 3 carats a ring he had personally selected from a jeweler on Fifth Avenue 8 years ago, back when he still had something to prove and someone he wanted to prove it to. The ring sat there catching the late evening light, and beside it a single folded note in Olivia's handwriting. Ethan stood frozen for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then he picked up the note with hands that were for the first time in longer than he could remember not entirely steady. "I was the only faithful person in this marriage. Don't look for me. You won't find me." He read it twice, then a third time as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less devastating on a fourth pass. "Olivia," he said out loud to no one, his voice cracking slightly on the second syllable in a way that would have shocked anyone who knew the Ethan Caldwell of the boardroom, the one who never raised his voice, never lost composure, never let anyone see him rattled. He walked through the apartment again faster this time, checking the guest room, the office, the terrace, calling her name into rooms that answered him only with the low hum of the city 20 floors below. Her passport was gone from the drawer in his office where they kept important documents. Her laptop was gone. 3 suitcases missing from the hall closet. This wasn't a woman storming out after a fight. This was a departure, planned, executed, complete. For a long moment, Ethan Caldwell, who had negotiated hostile takeovers without blinking, who had once talked a room of 40 investors into backing a project that later made him $400 million, simply stood in the middle of his own kitchen and did not know what to do. Then the old instinct kicked in: deny, minimize, control the narrative. He pulled out his phone and called Marcus, his head of security, a man who had worked for the Caldwell family for 11 years and had learned the hard way to ask no questions he didn't want the answers to. "Marcus, I need you to find my wife." "Sir." "She's not here. Her things are gone. I need this handled quietly. No police, not yet. I don't want this in the press." There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that meant Marcus was choosing his next words carefully. "Sir, if Mrs. Caldwell is missing and 7 months pregnant, I'd strongly recommend." "I said quietly, Marcus." Ethan's voice hardened, the CEO voice returning the one that ended arguments before they started. "I have a board meeting in 11 days. I have investors flying in from Singapore next week. The last thing this company needs is a headline about my wife vanishing. Find her. Bring her home. I'll handle the rest." He hung up before Marcus could respond, and for one brief, unguarded second, Ethan caught his own reflection in the darkened window overlooking Central Park. A billionaire alone in an enormous, empty apartment holding a folded note in one hand and a wedding ring in the other, and he did not recognize the expression on his own face. It looked for the first time in his adult life like fear. He told himself it wasn't fear. He told himself it was inconvenience. Frustration, the irritation of a man whose carefully constructed life had developed an unexpected wrinkle that would need to be smoothed over before anyone important noticed. He poured himself a whiskey he didn't taste and sat in the dark living room, replaying the note in his mind, and slowly the denial began cracking at the edges, letting something colder seep through. "I was the only faithful person in this marriage," she knew, not suspected. Knew. His phone buzzed. "Vanessa." He almost didn't answer. Then he did, because some old habit of control told him he needed information, needed to understand what she knew, what she might have said, whether this was somehow connected to her. "Hey," Vanessa said, her voice warm, unaware. "You disappeared on me. Everything okay?" "Olivia's gone," Ethan said flatly. A pause. "Gone where?" "I don't know. She left a note. She took her things. Her passport's gone." "Ethan, she's 7 months pregnant. Have you called the police?" "Not yet." "Why not?" He didn't answer right away, and in that silence, Vanessa Reed, for the first time in 2 years, felt something shift inside her. A small, cold recognition, quiet and unwelcome, that the man on the other end of the phone was more concerned about his board meeting than his missing pregnant wife. "Ethan," she said slowly, "call the police." "I will. I just need to think first." "Think about what she's carrying, a baby, and she's out there somewhere alone, and you're worried about optics." The words landed harder than she intended, mostly because they were true, and mostly because saying them out loud made Vanessa realize something about the man she'd spent 2 years falling for. She had told herself over and over that Ethan's marriage was already broken before she came along, that she wasn't the villain in someone else's story, just a woman who'd fallen for a man who happened to be married. But hearing him actually hesitate, before calling the police for his missing pregnant wife, cracked something open in her that she wasn't ready to look at directly. "I'll call you back," Ethan said, and hung up before she could argue further. He sat there another 20 minutes, whiskey untouched note still in his hand, before finally dialing the number for the 19th precinct. Detective Sarah Mitchell arrived at the Caldwell penthouse just after 10 that night, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 40s who had spent 18 years working missing persons cases in Manhattan and had developed over that time an almost supernatural ability to tell within the first 5 minutes of a conversation whether a husband was telling her everything or telling her exactly enough to make himself look innocent. Ethan was telling her exactly enough. "Walk me through your day," Sarah said, notebook, open pen ready, eyes never quite leaving his face. "I was at the office. I got home around 7. She was gone." "When did you last speak to her?" Ethan hesitated just slightly, just long enough for Sarah to notice. "This morning, before I left for work." "Did she seem distressed? Upset anything unusual?" "No, she seemed fine. That was a lie, and Sarah knew it was a lie, though she couldn't yet prove it. She'd been doing this job long enough to recognize the particular stillness of a man who was omitting, rather than inventing, choosing his words like a lawyer, instead of speaking like a husband whose pregnant wife had just vanished. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm going to need her phone records, her recent financial activity, and access to your security footage." "Of course, whatever you need." "And I'll need to speak to anyone she's been in contact with recently. Family, friends, anyone." Her parents passed years ago. She doesn't have much family, a few friends from before we married, but she wasn't close with them anymore. Sarah wrote that down, underlined it twice, because in her experience, isolated women who suddenly vanished weren't isolated by accident. Someone or something had cut those connections slowly over years until leaving became a woman's only option, and the note left on the counter began to read less like heartbreak and more like a plan that had been assembled over a very long time by someone with very little help. "Mr. Caldwell," Sarah said, closing her notebook, "I have to ask, is there anyone who might want to harm your wife? Any enemies, business disputes, anything unusual going on at the company?" Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "No, nothing like that." Another lie. Sarah could feel it settling into the room like humidity before a storm, and she made a note to pull his company's public filings first thing in the morning, a habit she'd developed after 20 years of watching powerful men lie about everything except the one thing that actually mattered. After Sarah left, Ethan sat alone in the dark for a long time, and slowly, methodically, the picture began assembling itself in his mind piece by piece, each one more unsettling than the last. Olivia hadn't just packed a bag and walked out in anger. She had disconnected her phone entirely, a process that typically took weeks to arrange discreetly. She had removed her name from at least 2 joint accounts, something Ethan discovered the next morning when his accountant called in a panic informing him that $40,000 had been quietly transferred out of a shared account over the past 2 months in amounts small enough not to trigger any alerts. 2 months. She had been planning this for 2 months. While Ethan had been at the Delancey Hotel, while he had been laughing in Vanessa's bed, silencing calls, telling himself his wife was simply bored and needy, Olivia had been sitting in that same apartment methodically dismantling her life with him, piece by piece preparing an exit so clean it left almost no trace. He thought of the woman he married. 26 years old, working 2 jobs helping him fold spreadsheets and cold call investors in the back office of an apartment they could barely afford, believing in him when literally no one else did. He thought of the way she used to look at him back then, like he was the answer to something she'd been searching for her whole life. He thought about when that look had started to change and realized with a discomfort he wasn't prepared for, that he genuinely could not pinpoint the moment. It had happened slowly. It had happened while he wasn't paying attention. It had happened probably exactly the way she'd planned her disappearance. Quietly, completely, without him noticing until it was already finished. The next morning, Marcus called with an update that made Ethan's stomach drop for the second time in 24 hours. "Sir, I pulled the security footage from the lobby and the private elevator like you asked. And there's a gap. 6 hours the day she left. The footage just cuts out." "What do you mean it cuts out?" "I mean, someone erased it, sir. Someone with access to the building's security system." Ethan's grip tightened around his phone. "That's not possible. That system requires 2-level clearance. Only building security, and I have that access." There was a pause on the line, uncomfortable and heavy. "I know, sir. That's what's bothering me, too." Ethan lowered the phone, slowly staring at nothing as the implications settled over him like ice water. Someone inside his own security apparatus had helped Olivia disappear without a trace. Someone had access to systems that only he was supposed to control, and had used that access to erase 6 hours of footage on the exact day his pregnant wife vanished from a $20 million penthouse without leaving behind a single clue. Either Olivia had help from someone deep inside his organization, or Olivia herself understood his systems, his codes, his security protocols far better than he had ever imagined a woman he considered just his wife could possibly understand them. He thought back uneasily to nights over the past year when he'd come home late and found Olivia in his home office saying she was simply organizing his files, helping him stay on top of paperwork he never had time for. He'd thought nothing of it then. He had thought of Olivia, if he was honest with himself, as background, support, a woman who managed the house and would eventually manage a child while he managed the empire. He was beginning to understand with a dread that settled deep in his chest that he had drastically, catastrophically underestimated his own wife. That afternoon, his general counsel called an emergency meeting. Ethan sat at the head of a long glass conference table in Caldwell International's 40th floor boardroom, surrounded by 6 lawyers, all of them wearing the particular tight-faced expression of professionals delivering news they knew their client did not want to hear. "Ethan," his general counsel began, "we've received notification that federal investigators have opened an inquiry into several of the company's recent transactions." The room went very quiet. "What kind of inquiry?" "Wire transfers, offshore accounts connected to the Meridian development deal, discrepancies in the reported valuations submitted to investors." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face, though decades of boardroom training kept his expression perfectly composed. "Who filed the complaint?" "We don't know yet. It came in through an anonymous whistleblower channel along with a substantial packet of internal documentation, financial statements, email correspondence, wire transfer records going back 3 years." "How substantial is substantial?" His lawyer slid a folder across the table and Ethan opened it to find copies of documents he recognized instantly, documents he had personally kept, locked in a safe in his home office, a safe only he and Olivia had the combination to. His hands, for the second time in 2 days, were not entirely steady. "There's more," the lawyer continued, voice careful. "Similar packets appear to have been sent to 2 financial journalists and the SEC's Enforcement Division. We're dealing with a coordinated, deliberate disclosure. This wasn't a disgruntled employee. Whoever did this had complete access to your most sensitive files, and they knew exactly what to send and exactly who to send it to." Ethan sat perfectly still, staring at the folder in front of him, at documents that had been sitting in a locked safe in his own bedroom, documents that proved things about Caldwell International that he had spent years making sure no one would ever see. And a single horrifying thought crystallized in his mind with total, sickening clarity. Olivia, not a bored, needy pregnant housewife who'd finally had enough of being ignored. A woman who had spent months quietly gathering evidence against her own husband's empire, who understood his financial systems well enough to identify exactly which transactions would trigger a federal investigation, who had access to a safe only the 2 of them could open, and who had waited patiently, methodically, until she had everything she needed before disappearing into thin air and detonating the entire structure of his life behind her. "Ethan," his lawyer's voice cut through the fog, "do you have any idea who could have done this?" Ethan looked up slowly, and for the first time since he'd walked into that empty penthouse and found a ring sitting on his kitchen counter, he understood with total and complete certainty that this was not a story about a heartbroken wife leaving her unfaithful husband. This was a woman executing a plan, and he had absolutely no idea how far it would go or how much more he stood to lose before it was finished. "No," he said quietly. "I don't know who could have done this." But he did know. He knew with a certainty that turned his stomach and made his hands go cold under the boardroom table. He simply couldn't say it out loud, yet couldn't voice the possibility that the quiet, gentle 7 months pregnant woman he had spent years overlooking had been sitting inside his own home, watching, learning, and preparing to bring his entire empire down around him. That evening, alone again in the penthouse, Ethan poured himself another whiskey and sat in the nursery in the one room Olivia had built with her own hands, staring at the small hand-painted birds along the ceiling molding. And for the first time since he was a young man with nothing and no one, Ethan Caldwell felt something crack open inside his chest that he did not have a name for. His phone buzzed. Vanessa again. He looked at the screen for a long moment before answering. "I saw the news," she said quietly. No warmth in her voice now, none of the teasing lightness from 2 nights ago. "Federal investigation. Ethan, what is happening?" "I don't know yet. Is this connected to Olivia?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring up at those small painted birds at the buttery yellow walls his wife had chosen for a daughter he hadn't even met yet. And he heard himself say something he hadn't planned to say, something that surprised even him with how true it felt as it left his mouth. "I think," he said slowly, "I think I have absolutely no idea who my wife actually is." On the other end of the line, in an apartment across the city that suddenly felt colder and emptier than it had 2 days earlier, Vanessa Reed closed her eyes, and for the first time since this whole affair began, felt genuinely, deeply afraid. Not for herself, for what she had helped set in motion, without ever fully understanding the woman standing quietly in the shadows the entire time. Miles away in a small rented house with plain white walls and a garden she'd never had time to plant before Olivia Brooks Caldwell sat by a window with one hand resting on her stomach, feeling her daughter shift and turn inside her, and watch the evening news report, the opening of a federal investigation into Caldwell International, with a stillness that looked to anyone who might have been watching almost like peace. She had known this day was coming for months. She had built it piece by careful piece with her own hands, the same way she'd painted birds on a nursery ceiling. The same patient precision, the same quiet resolve. She reached for the remote and turned off the television before the anchor could say her husband's name again, and in the silence that followed she whispered something softly to the baby inside her, something meant for no one else to hear. "It's almost over," she said. "I promise you, it's almost over." But it wasn't over. Not even close. Because what Ethan Caldwell did not yet know, what even Olivia herself could not fully predict, was that the documents she'd sent the investigation she'd triggered the empire beginning to crack under federal scrutiny was only the first domino in a chain reaction that would expose secrets far darker and far more dangerous than a billionaire's affair. Secrets buried deep inside Caldwell International that even Olivia, in all her careful research, had not fully uncovered yet. Secrets that would soon put not just Ethan's fortune, but possibly his freedom and hers at very real risk. And somewhere in that quiet house, as she finally closed her eyes to sleep, Olivia Brooks Caldwell had no idea that the most dangerous chapter of her carefully constructed plan was only just beginning. By the second morning, Ethan Caldwell had convinced himself of a story he desperately wanted to believe. Olivia was hormonal. Olivia was overwhelmed. Olivia had gone to stay with a friend for a few days to cool off, and she would come back once she'd made her point, the way she always eventually came back, because that was the pattern of every argument they'd ever had in 8 years of marriage. He repeated this theory to himself in the shower at his desk, in the back of the town car on the way to the office, until it started to sound almost plausible again. Patricia Wells did not share his optimism. She was the crisis communications consultant his general counsel had hired within hours of the federal inquiry becoming public, a sharp, unsmiling woman in her 50s who had handled scandals for 3 different Fortune 500 executives and had developed in that time an extremely low tolerance for clients who lied to her. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, sliding a folder across his desk, "I need you to understand something very clearly. This is not a business story anymore. This became a human interest story the moment the words pregnant wife and missing appeared in the same headline. She's not missing. She left. The public doesn't know that, and frankly neither do you with any certainty. What you have is a note. What the world has is a pregnant woman who vanished from a penthouse the same week her husband's company came under federal investigation. Do you see how that reads? Ethan's jaw tightened. It reads like a coincidence. Patricia looked at him for a long moment, the way a doctor looks at a patient who has just described symptoms of something serious while insisting he feels fine. Nobody believes in coincidences, Mr. Caldwell, least of all the internet. She was right, and by 10 that morning he had proof of exactly how right she was. Photographers had gathered outside the building lobby, a small cluster that grew to a crowd of nearly 30 by noon, shouting questions at him through the glass doors as security tried to clear a path to his car. "Where's Olivia? Did you have anything to do with her disappearance? Is it true you were with Vanessa Reed the night she vanished?" He kept his head down, his expression flat, the same composed mask he wore into every boardroom. But inside, something had started to fray. He had spent 20 years building a name that appeared on buildings, on magazine covers, on investment prospectuses, and in the space of 48 hours, that name had become something people shouted at him through glass. Detective Sarah Mitchell, meanwhile, was 3 miles uptown sitting across from a nurse practitioner in the waiting room of Olivia's obstetrics office, learning something that would reshape the entire direction of her investigation. She canceled her 32-week appointment 11 days before she disappeared, the nurse said, scrolling through the file on her screen. And she requested her full medical records be released electronically, ultrasounds, blood work, everything. Released to who? That's the thing. She didn't request a transfer to another practice in our system, which is what we'd normally see if a patient was just switching doctors. She requested a personal copy sent directly to an email address. Sarah leaned forward. "Do you have that email?" The nurse turned the screen around and Sarah wrote it down carefully in her notebook, a string of letters and numbers that meant nothing to her yet, but that she suspected would mean everything very soon. Not Olivia's known personal email, not anything connected to the Caldwell name at all. "One more thing," the nurse added almost as an afterthought. "She asked us not to mention anything about a change in providers if her husband's office called to confirm appointments. She was very specific about that. She said if anyone called checking on her behalf, we should just say she rescheduled." Sarah sat back slowly. A woman covering her tracks with her doctor's office wasn't a woman who left in a moment of emotional impulse. This was someone who had thought 2, 3, 4 steps ahead, someone who had anticipated that her husband might have people checking on her and had built in a cover story months in advance. "Detective," the nurse said quietly, "is she okay? I mean, is she safe wherever she is?" Sarah closed her notebook. "That's what I'm trying to find out." But privately, walking back to her car 20 minutes later, Sarah found herself thinking something she wouldn't have said out loud to anyone in that office. Olivia Caldwell didn't look like a woman in danger. She looked, based on everything Sarah had uncovered so far, like a woman who had spent months building the safest exit strategy of anyone Sarah had investigated in 18 years on the job. The question that kept her up that night wasn't whether Olivia was in danger. It was who had helped her build an exit that clean and why. By the 4th day, the story had metastasized beyond anything Ethan's crisis team could contain. A tabloid ran a front-page photo of Ethan and Vanessa leaving the Delancey Hotel together, time-stamped just 6 days before Olivia disappeared. The headline stretched across the top in block letters, "Billionaire's Secret Life, Where is His Pregnant Wife?" Vanessa saw it from her kitchen table, coffee going cold in front of her, her phone buzzing itself off the counter with notifications she was too afraid to open. When she finally did, she found 17 messages from her manager, all with some version of the same message. "We need to talk, now. Sponsors are pulling out. Have you seen what people are saying about you online?" She opened her Instagram with shaking hands and scrolled through a comment section that had transformed overnight from adoring fans discussing skincare routines into a mob calling her a homewrecker, a monster, a woman who had helped destroy a pregnant mother's life for a rich man's attention. A partnership with a wellness brand she'd worked with for 3 years posted a statement distancing themselves from her in light of recent developments. Her follower count, which had taken 6 years to build past 2 million, was dropping by the thousands every hour. She called Ethan, hands trembling. "I'm losing everything," she said the moment he picked up. Do you understand that my career, my brand, everything I built, it's collapsing because of this? I'm dealing with a federal investigation, Vanessa. I don't have time." "You don't have time?" Her voice cracked disbelief, sharpening into something colder. "I gave up 2 years of my life for you. I believed you when you told me your marriage was already over. And now I'm the villain in a story about your missing wife, and you're telling me you don't have time." There was a long silence on the line. "What do you want me to say?" Ethan finally asked, and something in his tone, flat, almost bored, hit Vanessa harder than anything he could have shouted. "I want you to say it's going to be okay," she said quietly. "I want you to say you'll fix this. I want you to say you actually care what happens to me." He didn't say any of it. And in that silence, stretching longer with every second, neither of them spoke. Vanessa Reed understood something about the man she had risked everything for. Something she had been too dazzled to see clearly until this exact moment, sitting alone at her kitchen table, watching her entire public identity dissolve in real time. He had never once in 2 years told her he loved her. She had simply never let herself notice. That evening, an anonymous email arrived in Vanessa's inbox, sent from an address she didn't recognize. No name attached, no explanation, just 4 lines of text and an attachment. "You should know what you attached yourself to. Ask him about Meridian. Ask him what really happened to the investors who pulled out in 2019. Ask him why his last 2 executive assistants signed non-disclosure agreements before they left the company." Vanessa stared at this message for a long time before opening the attachment, and when she did, her stomach turned over. It was a scanned financial document, heavily redacted, but the visible portions were enough to make her hands go cold. Wire transfers. Numbers with more zeros than she could easily process. A name she didn't recognize attached to an offshore account that, according to the document, had received funds diverted from an investor fund 3 years earlier. She didn't know what it meant exactly, but she knew enough to understand that whoever sent it wanted her to be afraid, and it was working. She thought about calling Ethan and asking him directly. Then she thought better of it. If whoever sent this had access to internal Caldwell documents, detailed enough to include wire transfer records, they very likely had access to Ethan's communications too. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, Vanessa Reed found herself wondering if the safest thing she could do was stop talking to Ethan Caldwell altogether. She didn't sleep that night. She sat with the document open on her laptop until 3 in the morning, reading it over and over, feeling the shape of something enormous and dangerous taking form just beyond what she could fully see. 2 days later, Caldwell International's board of directors convened an emergency session that Ethan had not called and could not stop. Charles Whitfield, the board's chairman, a silver-haired man in his 70s who had sat on the board since before Ethan took the company public, opened the meeting with a directness that made clear this was no longer a conversation Ethan controlled. "Ethan," he said, not bothering with pleasantries, "our stock dropped 14% in 3 trading days. 3 major investors have publicly signaled they're reviewing their positions. We have federal agents requesting documents from 4 different departments. And your personal life is on the cover of every tabloid in the country." "Charles, I understand the optics are—" "This isn't about optics." Whitfield's voice sharpened. "This is about whether this company survives the next quarter. The board is requesting formally that you step back from day-to-day operations while the investigation runs its course." The room went utterly silent. Ethan felt every eye at that table land on him at once, and for the first time in his career, he understood what it felt like to sit in a room he had once completely controlled, and realize the walls had quietly shifted while he wasn't paying attention. "You want me to step down?" "We want you to step back, temporarily. It's not personal, Ethan, it's protective, for you and for this company." "I built this company from nothing." His voice had an edge now, the composure finally slipping. "I am this company. And right now," Whitfield said, not unkindly, but without softening either, "that is exactly the problem." Ethan looked around the table at faces he had known for years, men and women who had sat beside him at galas, who had congratulated him at every milestone, who now regarded him with the careful, distant expression people reserve for something they're trying to determine how quickly they can separate themselves from. Not one of them met his eyes for more than a second. He left that meeting having agreed to a voluntary leave of absence, a phrase his lawyers assured him would look better in the press than the truth, which was that his own board had just forced him out of the company he'd spent 20 years building less than a week after his pregnant wife vanished from their home. He sat in the back of his car afterward, staring out at the city, moving past the window, and thought with a bitterness that surprised him of Olivia's note sitting folded in the drawer of his home office. "I was the only faithful person in this marriage." He had read it a dozen times since that first night, and every time it landed a little differently. At first, it had felt like an accusation. Now, sitting in the wreckage of everything he'd built, it felt closer to a warning he hadn't taken seriously enough. Detective Sarah Mitchell was at that exact hour standing in a storage facility in Queens, watching a manager unlock Unit 214 with a master key after 20 minutes of careful legal explanation about warrants and probable cause. The unit had been rented 8 months earlier under the name Olivia Brooks, not Caldwell. Brooks. Her maiden name, a detail that made Sarah's pulse quicken the moment she saw it on the rental agreement, because a woman who rents storage under her maiden name 8 months before disappearing isn't a woman acting on impulse. She's a woman who has been quietly separating pieces of her life from her husband's name for the better part of a year. Inside the unit, Sarah found 4 sealed boxes, a locked filing cabinet, and taped to the inside of the door a single sheet of paper that made her stop entirely still. It was a list. Dates, names, transaction amounts, written in careful, organized handwriting, cross-referenced with sticky notes in 3 different colors. And at the bottom, in Olivia's handwriting, a note that wasn't addressed to Ethan this time, but seemed unsettlingly to be addressed to whoever eventually found this room. "If you're reading this, you already know more than he wants you to. Be careful who you trust inside the company. Not everyone who looks like they work for him actually does." Sarah photographed the note, called for backup to properly process the unit, and stood there a moment longer, feeling the shape of the case shifting under her feet. This wasn't a missing persons case anymore, not really, and she suspected it hadn't been one from the very first night. This was something bigger, something Olivia Caldwell had spent the better part of a year quietly building toward brick by careful brick long before she ever packed a single suitcase. Not everyone who looks like they work for him actually does. Sarah thought immediately of Marcus Ethan's head of security, the man with exclusive access to the building's surveillance systems, the same system that had mysteriously erased 6 hours of footage on the exact day Olivia vanished. She pulled out her phone and made a call to her partner back at the precinct. "I need everything on Caldwell International's security staff," she said. "Every employee with system-level access. Start with anyone who's left the company in the past 18 months. It took her partner less than 2 hours to call back with a name that would crack the case open in a way neither of them expected. Grace Lynn, former junior analyst in Caldwell International's finance department, resigned 11 months ago, citing personal reasons. Prior to her resignation, Grace Lynn had been granted temporary elevated access to internal financial systems during an audit access that, according to company records, had never been formally revoked after her departure. Sarah stared at the employee file photo on her partner's screen. A young woman, mid-20s, unremarkable on paper, the kind of employee who blends invisibly into any large company. Except that 11 months ago, this particular unremarkable employee had walked away from Caldwell International with a set of system credentials. Nobody had bothered to shut off credentials that could theoretically erase 6 hours of security footage from a private penthouse elevator without leaving a trace. "Bring her in," Sarah said. "Today, if we can." They couldn't find her that day, or the next. Grace Lynn had also vanished, apparently sometime in the past 2 weeks, her apartment lease terminated early. Her last known employer confirming she'd resigned from her new position without notice, just 4 days before Olivia Caldwell walked out of her penthouse for the last time. 2 women, both quiet, both underestimated, both gone within days of each other, leaving behind almost nothing except a trail of documents precisely calculated to bring down an empire. Sarah sat with that information for a long time before she finally understood what she was actually looking at. This wasn't a missing wife who happened to stumble onto evidence of her husband's crimes. This was a coordinated operation, and Olivia Caldwell had not built it alone. When Ethan learned about Grace Lynn 3 days later from his own lawyers rather than the detective who was legally obligated to keep him only partially informed, something in him finally broke through the last of his denial. Grace Lynn, he repeated slowly. Sitting in his home office, the same office where his safe had sat for years, the safe only he and Olivia knew the combination to. I don't even know who that is. She worked in your finance department for 2 years, his lawyer said. Junior analyst. You likely never interacted with her directly. Then why would Olivia? He stopped himself, the sentence trailing off as a memory surfaced unbidden in suddenly enormous insignificance. A dinner maybe 18 months ago. Some charity gala he'd barely paid attention to, Olivia introducing him briefly to a young woman from his own company. Someone Olivia had apparently struck up a friendship with at a company family event he hadn't even wanted to attend. He remembered almost nothing about the conversation. He remembered Olivia's hand on his arm, her voice light and social, saying something like, "Grace works in finance, isn't that funny? We met at the holiday party and just clicked." He had thought nothing of it. Networking, socializing, the kind of harmless small talk his wife engaged in constantly while he stood beside her, thinking about the next deal on his calendar. He had had no idea he was watching his wife recruit an inside operative directly under his nose at his own company holiday party while he stood 3 feet away making small talk with a hedge fund manager about golf. She's been planning this for over a year, Ethan said quietly, more to himself than to his lawyer. Not months, a year. It appears that way, yes, and I had absolutely no idea. His lawyer, a careful man who had represented Caldwell International for over a decade, chose his next words with visible caution. Ethan, I have to ask you something and I need an honest answer because it affects how we handle the federal side of this. What? Is there anything in those documents that could actually sink you? Not embarrass you. Sink you. Criminal exposure, not just PR damage. Ethan sat very still for a long moment, staring at the space on the wall, where a framed photo of him and Olivia used to hang a photo he'd taken down 2 nights ago in a fit of anger and never rehung. I don't know yet, he said finally, which was in its own way the most honest thing he had said to anyone since the entire nightmare began. Because the truth was, Ethan Caldwell had built an empire on decisions he'd made without fully accounting for who might one day be paying close enough attention to notice them. He had assumed for 20 years that the people around him, his wife included, were too occupied with their own smaller concerns to ever look closely enough to understand what he was actually doing. He was beginning to understand in the worst possible way exactly how wrong that assumption had been. Federal agent Denise Reyes arrived at Caldwell International's temporary satellite office 9 days after Olivia's disappearance, armed with a formal request for Ethan's voluntary interview, the kind of request that both parties understood was really not voluntary at all. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, sliding a folder across the table between them, flanked by 2 other agents and Ethan's increasingly nervous legal team. "I want to walk you through the Meridian Development transactions from 2019. I've already provided documentation to. I know what you've provided. I'm asking about what you haven't." She opened the folder, revealing a series of wire transfer records. In March of 2019, $42 million moved from an investor escrow account into a shell entity registered in the Caymans. That entity transferred the funds over the following 6 weeks into 3 subsidiary accounts, 2 of which eventually funneled back into Caldwell International under a different transaction category. "Can you explain that structure to me?" Ethan's lawyer placed a hand briefly on his arm, a silent instruction to say nothing, but Agent Reyes continued before anyone could respond. "Because from where I'm sitting, Mr. Caldwell, that looks like investor funds were diverted, laundered through offshore accounts, and reintroduced into your company's operating capital under false pretenses. That's not a paperwork error, that's fraud." "I want to consult with my counsel before answering further questions," Ethan said, his voice steady, despite the ice spreading through his chest. "Of course." Agent Reyes closed the folder, unbothered, the calm of someone who had all the time in the world. "Take whatever time you need. Just know that the documents we received didn't come with gaps, Mr. Caldwell. Whoever sent them knew exactly what they were looking at, and knew exactly what they needed to include to make this case airtight. Somebody understood your business better than you apparently gave them credit for." She left the room without waiting for a response, and Ethan sat there surrounded by lawyers murmuring about strategy and exposure and privilege, hearing almost none of it, because all he could think about was Olivia sitting across from him at their kitchen table 18 months ago, asking him casually the way she often did, how the Meridian deal was going, whether the investors were happy, whether everything was proceeding smoothly. He had told her everything, freely, because he had never once considered that his wife might be listening for reasons beyond simple spousal curiosity. Miles away in the small rented house, Olivia now called home. She sat with a cup of tea, gone lukewarm, watching a muted television replay, footage from outside Caldwell International's headquarters, federal agents visible in the background of a reporter's live shot. She felt the baby shift inside her, a small, insistent movement along her ribs, and pressed a hand there instinctively, the way she'd started doing every time the stress became too heavy to hold alone. Her phone buzzed an encrypted messaging app, a single new message from a contact saved only as G. They interviewed him today. Agent Reyes is sharp. "I think she already knows more than she's letting on," Olivia typed back with steady hands. "Good. Let her find the rest on her own. That's how it needs to look. Are you doing okay?" "You haven't answered in 2 days." Olivia looked down at her stomach, at the small shape of her daughter visible now beneath her shirt, and felt something twist inside her that had nothing to do with strategy or documents or federal investigations. "I'm tired," she typed honestly, something she rarely allowed herself to admit, even to Grace, the one person who had risked everything alongside her. "I didn't think it would feel like this. I thought it would feel like winning." The reply came a moment later. "It will, eventually. Right now it just has to feel like surviving." Olivia set the phone down and sat in the quiet of the small living room, hands still resting on her stomach, and allowed herself for just a few minutes to feel the full weight of everything she had done. She had not lied when she told Grace she thought it would feel like winning. She had spent months imagining this exact moment, imagining Ethan's empire crumbling exactly the way it was crumbling now, and she had believed somewhere in the planning of it all that watching it happen would bring her some kind of relief. Instead, it mostly just felt heavy and lonely and frightening in ways she hadn't fully anticipated, 7 months pregnant, alone in a house that wasn't really home yet, watching the father of her unborn child dismantled piece by piece on muted television, knowing she was the one who had lit the fuse. She thought briefly about calling him, just to hear his voice, just to ask if he was okay. She didn't. She closed her eyes instead, breathed slowly through the tightness in her chest, and reminded herself the way she had reminded herself every difficult night for the past 8 months that this wasn't about revenge. It had never been about revenge. It was about making sure her daughter was never raised by a man who believed the people who loved him quietly were the ones he was allowed to ignore. Back in Manhattan that same evening, Vanessa Reed made a decision that would detonate the second half of this story before the week was even finished. She sat across a small conference table from Agent Reyes, and a young associate attorney her own lawyer had recommended the anonymous document from 2 nights earlier printed and placed carefully between them. "I'm not a target in this investigation," Vanessa said, her voice tighter than she wanted it to be. "I need to understand that clearly before I say anything else." "That depends entirely on what you tell us," Agent Reyes replied evenly. "Right now you're a witness. Cooperative witnesses tend to stay witnesses." Vanessa looked down at the document, at the wire transfer records that had kept her awake for 2 nights straight, and thought about Ethan's voice on the phone, flat and distant, refusing to tell her he cared what happened to her. "Someone sent me this," she said, finally sliding the printed pages across the table. "Anonymously, 4 days ago. I don't know who, but I think whoever it was wanted me to understand exactly what I'd attached myself to." Agent Reyes studied the document for a long moment, then looked up with an expression that told Vanessa she had just handed the federal government something they very badly wanted. "Ms. Reed," she said carefully, "I'd like you to walk me through everything you know about Ethan Caldwell's business dealings. Everything he's told you, even things that seemed unimportant at the time." And Vanessa Reed, sitting in a cold conference room with her career already in ruins and nothing left to protect, began for the first time to talk. 3 days later, the story broke across every major outlet, simultaneously Ethan Caldwell's mistress cooperating with federal investigators. The headline ran beneath a photo of Vanessa leaving the federal building, sunglasses on, expression unreadable, and by the time Ethan saw it sitting alone in the penthouse that had once felt like the crowning achievement of his entire life, he understood with total clarity that there was no longer a single person left standing beside him. His wife had orchestrated his downfall from the shadows for over a year. His board had forced him out of his own company. And now the woman he had betrayed his marriage for was sitting across from federal agents telling them everything she knew. He poured a whiskey he didn't taste, sat alone in a nursery painted buttery yellow with small hand-painted birds along the ceiling, and for the first time since this entire nightmare began, Ethan Caldwell allowed himself to wonder, with a dread that settled deep and permanent in his chest, exactly how much further this was going to go before it finally stopped. He did not yet know that the documents already circulating, devastating as they were, represented only a fraction of what Olivia Brooks Caldwell had actually uncovered in her year of quiet, patient investigation. Buried deeper still in files, even Grace Lynn hadn't fully understood when she copied them, sat evidence of something far more dangerous than fraud, something connected to names and transactions that stretched well beyond Caldwell International's own walls, something that would soon put people far more powerful and far more ruthless than a disgraced billionaire directly in Olivia's path. And somewhere in that quiet rented house, Olivia Brooks Caldwell had no idea that the encrypted phone in her hand, the one connecting her to Grace, the one carrying the last threads of her carefully built plan, was about to receive a message that would change absolutely everything. The message from Grace arrived at 11:42 that night, 6 words long, and Olivia would remember exactly where she was standing when she read them for the rest of her life. They found the drive. Get out now. Olivia stood frozen in the small kitchen of the rented house phone. In one hand, the other pressed instinctively against her stomach, and felt the floor of her carefully constructed plan shift beneath her for the first time in over a year. She had prepared for federal investigators. She had prepared for reporters, for lawyers, for the possibility that Ethan himself might hire someone to track her down out of pure wounded pride. She had not, in all her months of planning, fully prepared for the possibility that the people connected to the Meridian deal were not simply corporate executives protecting their reputations. She typed back with fingers that were, for the first time in a long time, not entirely steady. Who found it? What drive? The response took 90 agonizing seconds to arrive. The backup copy, the one with the Delacroix files. Someone broke into my apartment tonight. I wasn't there. I need you to leave the house now, Olivia. Not tomorrow. Tonight. Olivia sat down hard on the edge of a kitchen chair, her heart pounding in a way that made the baby shift uneasily inside her, as if her daughter could feel the sudden spike of her mother's fear translating directly through her bloodstream. She had heard the name Delacroix before, buried deep in files she and Grace had spent months quietly copying, a name attached to an offshore holding company that had moved money through the Meridian deal in ways that went far beyond the garden-variety fraud she'd expected to find when she started looking. She had assumed when she first began investigating her husband 18 months ago that she was looking for evidence of an affair, or at worst some sloppy accounting Ethan had used to inflate the company's numbers for investors. She had not expected to find what she eventually found buried 3 layers deep in encrypted folders on a laptop Ethan thought was password protected enough to keep her out. She had not expected to find Marcus Delacroix, a name that meant nothing to the general public, but that had made Grace go pale the first time Olivia showed her the transaction records, because Grace, unlike Olivia, had heard whispers about that name inside the finance department, quiet conversations that stopped abruptly whenever someone senior walked past. He's not just an investor, Grace had told her months ago sitting across from Olivia at a diner 3 neighborhoods from the Caldwell penthouse, voice barely above a whisper, even though the nearest table was empty. People who've worked with his money longer than me say he doesn't just launder for himself. He launders for people who make the SEC look like a parking enforcement office. If Ethan owes him money and can't pay because of the federal investigation, that's not a lawsuit problem. Olivia, that's a different kind of problem entirely. Olivia had filed that warning away at the time, focused on the larger goal, telling herself that exposing Ethan's fraud to federal investigators would naturally expose Delacroix too, would let the government handle a danger that felt from the safety of careful planning 18 months ago more theoretical than real. Sitting in her kitchen now, phone buzzing again with a second message from Grace that theoretical danger had just become entirely terrifyingly real. "Olivia, please, I mean it. Pack what you need for tonight and go. I'll call you when I'm somewhere safe." Olivia looked around the small, rented living room at the nursery she'd started assembling in the second bedroom with far less care and far more haste than the one she'd painted with her own hands in Manhattan, at the life she had built here in 6 short weeks that had felt for the first time in years entirely her own. She thought about her daughter, 33 weeks along, now close enough to full term, that any sudden physical stress carried real risk, and she made a decision with the same cold, clear precision that had carried her through every other decision of the past year. She would not run blindly into the night alone, 7.5 months pregnant with no plan. She would call the one person whose entire professional life was built around protecting exactly this kind of danger. Detective Sarah Mitchell answered on the second ring, despite the hour. Despite the fact that it was well past midnight, because 18 years on the job had taught her that late-night calls on an active case were rarely good news and never worth ignoring. "Detective Mitchell. This is Olivia Caldwell." A pause heavy with everything that name now carried. "I need your help." Sarah sat up straight in bed, instantly awake, reaching for the notepad she kept on her nightstand out of habit. "Mrs. Caldwell, where are you? Are you safe?" "I'm safe right now. I don't know if I'll be safe in an hour." Olivia's voice was steady, but Sarah could hear the effort it was taking to keep it that way. "I have information about the Meridian transactions that goes beyond what's already public. I have a source who just told me someone broke into her apartment tonight, looking for evidence connected to a man named Marcus Delacroix." Sarah wrote the name down, underlined it, feeling the particular electric focus that came with a case suddenly cracking open in a direction she hadn't anticipated. "Delacroix, I need you to spell that for me." Olivia did, and continued, each sentence coming faster now. The careful composure of months of planning finally giving way to the raw urgency of the moment. "He's connected to organized financial crime, detective. Real organized crime, not just corporate fraud. My husband owes him money that he can't pay now that his assets are frozen and his company's under investigation. If people connected to Delacroix are already looking for physical evidence, they're not going to stop at evidence. Eventually, they're going to start looking for the people who collected it. Meaning you. Meaning me. And possibly my source. She's already on the move." Sarah was already pulling on clothes with the phone wedged between her ear and shoulder, calling out to her partner in the next room to wake up and start making calls. "Olivia, I need your location, right now. I can have officers there in 15 minutes. There was a long pause on the line, the particular silence of a woman who had spent over a year trusting almost no one, weighing whether the moment had finally come to trust someone completely. "I need you to promise me something first," Olivia said quietly. "I can't promise anything about the investigation, Mrs. Caldwell, you understand that." "Not about the investigation. About my daughter. If something happens to me tonight, I need someone to make sure she's safe. I need someone who isn't connected to my husband or his company, or anyone who might have a reason to make her disappear too." Sarah stopped in the middle of her bedroom, one shoe on, and felt something in her chest tighten at the raw fear underneath Olivia's careful, controlled voice. The fear of a woman who had spent a year being strategic and brilliant and fearless, finally admitting in the middle of the night to the one thing that actually terrified her. "I promise you," Sarah said, and meant it completely. "Now give me your address." Olivia gave it to her. Officers arrived in 11 minutes, not 15, and Sarah herself arrived 20 minutes after that, finding Olivia sitting fully dressed on the couch, a packed bag by the door, hand resting protectively over her stomach, watching the street outside through a gap in the curtains with the alert, unblinking focus of someone who had spent the last 90 minutes convinced every passing car might be the one that finally found her. "Nobody followed you," Sarah confirmed, checking with the officers stationed outside. "Streets clear, buildings clear." Olivia exhaled slowly, some of the rigid tension leaving her shoulders for the first time since Grace's message arrived. "Thank you." Sarah sat down across from her notebook out, but for a moment simply looked at the woman in front of her, 7 months pregnant, exhausted in a way that went far beyond physical, and felt something shift in her professional assessment of this case that had been building for days. "I owe you an apology," Sarah said finally. Olivia looked up surprised. "For what?" "For the first week of this investigation, I treated you like a person of interest, a wife with a motive." Sarah set down her pen. "I want you to know I don't see it that way anymore. I see a woman who found out her husband was committing serious crimes and made an incredibly difficult choice to do something about it at real personal risk while pregnant and alone. That took more courage than most people have." Olivia's composure, held so carefully for so many months, finally cracked just slightly, just enough for a single tear to escape before she wiped it away with the back of her hand. "I didn't feel courageous. I felt like I didn't have a choice. Every time I thought about staying quiet, about just taking the baby and leaving without saying anything, I kept thinking about all the people who invested their savings in his company because they trusted him. Retired teachers, small business owners, people who believed in the story he was selling because I believed in it too once. You could have just left quietly. Nobody would have blamed you. I would have blamed me." Olivia looked down at her hands. "I spent 8 years standing next to a man while he became someone I didn't recognize, telling myself it wasn't my responsibility to notice what he was doing, as long as I wasn't the one doing it. I'm not going to raise my daughter believing that silence is the same thing as innocence." Sarah nodded slowly, writing nothing down for a moment, simply letting that sit between them. Then she opened her notebook again, because the danger Olivia had called about hadn't disappeared, just because the immediate threat outside her window had. "Tell me everything you know about Marcus Delacroix," she said. "Everything. We don't have much time." What Olivia told her over the next 40 minutes would reshape the entire federal investigation and put agents from 3 different agencies on a case that had started less than 2 weeks earlier as a straightforward missing persons report. Marcus Delacroix operated through a network of shell companies designed to look like legitimate private equity funneling money for clients who needed their fortunes cleaned of origins too dangerous to examine closely. Ethan had first taken money from one of Delacroix's entities 4 years earlier during a cash crunch on a development project that had gone badly over budget, a loan that came with terms Ethan hadn't fully understood until it was too late to refuse them. The Meridian deal, the one now under federal investigation, had been Ethan's attempt to pay that debt back, quietly routing investor funds through the same offshore structure Delacroix had originally used to lend him the money, effectively laundering Delacroix's dirty money back to its source, while skimming enough on each transaction to keep his own operating capital afloat. "He didn't start out corrupt," Olivia said quietly, staring at a spot on the wall somewhere past Sarah's shoulder. "I want you to understand that because I think it matters. Ethan made one bad decision under pressure years ago when the company was struggling and he was terrified of losing everything he'd built. And then that one decision required another decision to cover it, and then another, until eventually he was so far in that I don't think he even remembers what it felt like to run a company, honestly. That doesn't excuse what he did." "No," Olivia agreed. "It doesn't. But I spent a long time trying to understand how the man I married became someone who could look me in the eye every night for years while doing this, and I think the answer is just that it happens slowly. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to become a criminal. They just keep making the easier choice instead of the harder one over and over until eventually there's no path back to who they used to be." Sarah studied her for a long moment. "You still care about him?" Olivia didn't answer right away, her hand moving slowly over her stomach, feeling the small, insistent movements of the daughter she and Ethan had made together before everything fell apart between them. "I care about who he was before all of this," she said finally. "I'm not sure that person exists anymore, but I loved him once completely, and I don't think that kind of love just disappears because someone becomes a stranger. It just changes into something sadder." 3 hours later, at just past 4 in the morning, Grace Lynn arrived at a police safe house on the outskirts of the city, escorted by 2 federal agents, her hands still shaking from an adrenaline crash that had lasted since the moment she'd walked into her apartment and found the door already ajar. Drawers pulled open. Her laptop. Gone a small camera she kept hidden in a bookshelf, thankfully. Still recording footage of two men in dark clothing who had spent 11 minutes searching her apartment before leaving empty-handed, because the actual drive, the one with the full Delacroix documentation, had never been in that apartment at all. It had been in a safety deposit box under a name that belonged to neither Grace nor Olivia, opened 14 months earlier, as one of the very first steps in a plan that had taken over a year to fully execute. "They're going to realize I moved it," Grace said, sitting across from Agent Reyes in a small, sparsely furnished room, still wearing the same clothes she'd fled her apartment in. "Once they figure out the drive wasn't there, they're going to come looking for me directly." "You're safe here," Agent Reyes assured her. "This location isn't connected to your name in any system Delacroix's people could access." "You don't understand who these people are." Grace's voice shook. "I saw the transaction records for 8 months before I ever showed anything to Olivia. I know what happens to people who cause problems for men like Marcus Delacroix. It's not lawsuits, it's not federal charges. People just disappear." Agent Reyes leaned forward, her expression softening slightly, though her voice remained steady and professional. "Which is exactly why we need that drive, Grace. The full documentation is the difference between an investigation that takes down Ethan Caldwell for financial fraud and an investigation that dismantles an entire money laundering network. If we can trace Delacroix's operation completely, we can protect you, Olivia, and everyone else. This network has touched permanently. Right now, you and Olivia are loose ends to these people. Once the network is fully exposed and prosecuted, you're not loose ends anymore. You're witnesses who already did the damage. There's no reason left to come after you." Grace was quiet for a long moment, turning that logic over, before finally reaching into the lining of her jacket and pulling out a small key worn smooth from months of being carried everywhere she went, never left behind, not even for a single night. "Chase Bank on Lexington," she said. "Box 4471. The password to decrypt everything on the drive is in my email in a draft folder. Olivia and I have both had access to for the last year. We never sent the emails. We just wrote them and left them as drafts, so there'd never be a message to intercept." Agent Reyes looked at her for a moment, with something close to genuine admiration. "That's remarkably careful planning for two women with no background in intelligence work." Grace almost laughed, the sound cracking with exhaustion. "Olivia used to say we were just careful because we didn't have a choice. Powerful men get away with everything because they assume the people around them are too small to notice or too scared to do anything if they do notice. We just decided to stop being either of those things." By 7 that morning, federal agents had retrieved the drive, and by 9, a team of forensic accountants and financial crimes specialists had begun the painstaking work of decrypting and cross-referencing what turned out to be nearly 4 years of detailed financial records connecting Caldwell International, Marcus Delacroix, and at least 11 other shell entities spread across 6 countries. What they found exceeded even Agent Reyes's expectations. Ethan Caldwell was not simply guilty of investor fraud. The documentation revealed a money laundering pipeline that had processed over 4 years more than $300 million in funds connected to criminal enterprises, a portion of which Ethan had personally facilitated with full knowledge of their origin, and a portion of which, more damning still, revealed the involvement of at least 2 other prominent businessmen whose names would send shockwaves through New York's financial community once they became public. One of those names was Charles Whitfield. The same Charles Whitfield who less than 2 weeks earlier had sat at the head of Caldwell International's boardroom table and calmly informed Ethan that the board was requesting his voluntary leave of absence. His expression carefully composed his tone, almost paternal, in its concern for the company's reputation. Sarah Mitchell was the one who delivered that piece of information to Ethan personally, arriving at the penthouse just past 11 that morning with 2 federal agents beside her watching his face carefully as she laid it out. "Charles Whitfield has been receiving payments through the same offshore network as you for the past 3 years, Sarah said, watching something complicated move across Ethan's face. Disbelief and something almost like relief tangled together, the strange comfort of discovering you weren't the only monster in a story you'd assumed was entirely your own creation. He's the one who originally introduced you to Delacroix's initial loan 4 years ago, isn't he? Ethan sat down slowly on the edge of his own couch in the apartment that felt increasingly like a museum exhibit of a life that no longer belonged to him. He told me it was a private lending group. discreet investors who preferred to stay out of the public markets. He said it was completely legal, just unconventional. And you believed him? I needed the money, Ethan said quietly, and for the first time since this entire nightmare had begun, his voice carried something that sounded almost like genuine shame rather than practiced damage control. The company was 3 weeks from missing payroll. I had 400 employees whose families depended on those paychecks, and Charles offered me a way out. And I didn't ask enough questions because I didn't want to hear answers that would have made me walk away from money I desperately needed. That's not an excuse for what came after. I know. Ethan put his head in his hands, and Sarah watched a man who had spent his entire adult life projecting absolute control finally completely run out of road. I know it's not an excuse. I made the deal because I was desperate, and then I kept making worse deals because I was ashamed of the first one and didn't know how to undo it without destroying everything I'd built. And now I've lost the company anyway. I lost it trying to protect something I'd already ruined a long time before any of this. Sarah watched him for a long moment, and despite everything, despite the fear this man had put his own pregnant wife through, despite the fraud, despite the affair, she felt something that surprised her. Not sympathy exactly, but a recognition of the particular common human tragedy of watching someone destroy their own life. One small, understandable compromise at a time, each one feeling survivable in the moment until they added up to something that couldn't be survived at all. Mr. Caldwell, she said finally, I need to inform you that federal agents will be executing an arrest warrant within the hour. You have the right to remain silent. Ethan looked up at her, and for just a moment before the practiced composure returned, before the CEO mask slid back into place out of sheer muscle memory, Sarah saw something in his expression that looked almost like relief. The relief of a man who had spent years carrying a weight so heavy he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand without. It finally allowed to set it down, even if setting it down meant losing everything else in the process. The arrest, when it happened 40 minutes later, was quiet. No dramatic perp walk through crowds of photographers, no handcuffs displayed for cameras. Just 2 federal agents escorting a man in a gray suit out of a Manhattan penthouse lobby and into an unmarked car, while a small cluster of photographers who had gathered outside for days finally got the photo they'd been waiting for. The billionaire who had once graced the cover of Forbes, now walking silently toward a car that would take him somewhere very different from the world he'd built. Vanessa Reed watched the footage from her apartment, sitting alone on her couch, her career in ruins, her name forever linked to a scandal she was only now beginning to fully understand the depth of. She thought, watching Ethan's face on the muted television screen, about the 2 years she'd spent believing she was falling in love with a brilliant, ambitious man who simply happened to be trapped in an unhappy marriage. She realized now she had never actually known him at all. She had known a performance carefully maintained, designed to be exactly attractive enough to keep her interested, and exactly vague enough to keep her from asking the questions that might have exposed the truth underneath it. Her phone buzzed. A text from her manager. Statements ready for your approval. We're distancing you completely from the criminal charges. Cooperation with feds should help rebuild some trust eventually. Not overnight, but eventually. Vanessa read it twice, then set the phone down without responding, and allowed herself for the first time in 2 years to cry not for Ethan, and not entirely for herself, but for the version of her own life she'd once imagined. Back before she'd learned that the man she'd built, that imagined future around, had been capable of this kind of devastation the entire time she'd known him, hidden just beneath the surface she'd been too infatuated to look past. Olivia learned of Ethan's arrest from Sarah Mitchell, directly sitting in the small, unremarkable safe house the department had moved her to for the remainder of the investigation. A modest 2-bedroom home in a quiet suburb an hour outside the city, chosen specifically because nothing about it connected to any version of the life she'd once lived. It's done, Sarah told her, sitting across the kitchen table, watching Olivia's face carefully for a reaction. He's in federal custody. Formal charges will be filed within the next 48 hours. Securities fraud, wire fraud, money laundering conspiracy. Likely more once the full scope of the Delacroix network is mapped out. Olivia sat very still, hands wrapped around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking, and felt an entire year of careful, controlled, relentless planning finally arrive at the ending she'd spent months imagining. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like grief. "How long," she asked quietly, "do you think he'll serve?" "That's not something I can predict, given the scope potentially significant time. His lawyers will fight it, obviously. There may be a plea arrangement in exchange for full cooperation, identifying Delacroix's other partners." Sarah paused. "Olivia, can I ask you something, and you don't have to answer if it's too personal?" Olivia looked up. "Do you regret any of it?" Olivia considered the question with the same careful precision she'd applied to every decision of the past year, turning it over fully before answering. "I regret that it had to happen this way. I regret that my daughter is going to grow up with a father who's in prison instead of a father who chose at some earlier point to just be honest with the people who trusted him. I regret 4 years of a marriage I believed was real, when apparently large parts of it were built on choices I never knew he was making." She wrapped both hands more firmly around the mug. "But I don't regret doing what I did. If I'd stayed silent, if I'd just quietly divorced him and disappeared with my daughter and let everyone else's savings evaporate to protect my own comfort, I don't think I could have lived with that. Some things matter more than staying comfortable." Sarah nodded slowly, and something crossed her face that looked almost like admiration held carefully in check by professional distance. "For what it's worth, in 18 years of doing this job, I've met a lot of people caught up in cases like this. Most of them are either victims or perpetrators, sometimes both at once. You're one of the only people I've met who chose deliberately at real personal cost to be neither." Olivia's composure finally broke, just slightly tears gathering that she didn't bother wiping away this time. "I'm just trying to make sure my daughter grows up knowing her mother didn't stay quiet when it mattered." "She's going to know that," Sarah said. "Trust me." That evening, alone in the unfamiliar safe house, feeling the particular ache of 33 weeks of pregnancy settling into her lower back, Olivia sat by the window and allowed herself finally to feel the full weight of everything that had happened over the past 2 weeks. The culmination of a year and a half of careful planning, finally realized in the worst and most necessary way possible. She thought about the boardroom 18 months ago, standing next to Ethan at that holiday party meeting Grace Lynn for the first time, and recognizing almost instantly a quiet intelligence and quiet anger that mirrored something she'd been carrying herself for longer than she wanted to admit. She thought about the months of careful documentation, the storage unit under her maiden name, the safety deposit box, the encrypted messages, the medical records quietly transferred, the financial protections slowly built, brick by brick, while she smiled through galas and dinner parties and pretended to be exactly the oblivious, supportive wife everyone assumed she was. She thought about the exact moment nearly a year ago now when she'd finally understood that the man she'd married, the man she'd once believed in completely when nobody else did, had become someone capable of destroying strangers' financial futures without losing a single night's sleep over it. She remembered the specific grief of that realization, sharper in some ways than the grief of learning about Vanessa, because an affair was a betrayal of her personally. But the fraud was a betrayal of everyone, a wound that reached far beyond their marriage into hundreds of lives Ethan had never bothered to consider. Her phone rang an unfamiliar local number, and she almost let it go to voicemail before something made her answer. "Olivia." Ethan's voice, quiet, hollow, unmistakable, even after everything. She felt her whole body go still. "How are you calling me right now?" "One phone call, that's what they give you." A pause heavy with everything neither of them knew how to say. "I wasn't sure you'd answer." "I almost didn't." "I don't blame you." Another pause, longer this time. "Olivia, I need you to know something, and I don't expect it to change anything. I don't expect forgiveness. I just need to say it out loud to someone before all of this becomes lawyers and hearings and things that stop feeling human." Olivia closed her eyes, one hand resting on her stomach, feeling her daughter shift and settle. "Say it. I'm sorry." His voice cracked just slightly, the sound of a man whose careful composure had finally completely run out. "Not for getting caught. I know that's what everyone assumes I mean, and maybe some small, selfish part of me does mean that too. I won't pretend I'm a better person than I am. But I'm sorry for who I let myself become while you were standing right next to me the entire time, believing I was someone worth building a life with. I'm sorry I made you choose between staying silent and protecting yourself or speaking up and risking everything. No wife should ever have to make that choice about her own husband. Olivia sat with that for a long moment, tears falling freely now, unchecked in the quiet of a safe house an hour outside the only city she'd ever really called home. You didn't just betray strangers, Ethan. You betrayed our daughter before she's even been born. She's going to grow up knowing her father chose money and pride over honesty over and over for years. That's not something an apology fixes. I know. His voice was barely above a whisper now. I know it doesn't fix anything. I just needed you to know that somewhere underneath everything I became. I still remember who I used to be before I let all of this happen. I remember the man who used to fold spreadsheets with you in that tiny apartment, who had nothing, and believed that was enough because you believed in him. I lost that man somewhere along the way, and I don't know exactly when, but I know I'd give anything. Everything I have left, which admittedly isn't much anymore, to have made different choices back when it still would have mattered. Da kisa tita, como estás? Olivia wiped her face with the back of her hand, feeling something in her chest ache with a grief that was complicated and layered and would likely take years to fully untangle. Take care of yourself, Ethan, whatever happens next. For what it's worth, I hope you find your way back to being that man again. Not for me, for her. Can I ask you something before you go? What? The name. Have you decided on a name yet? Olivia was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at a quiet suburban street that felt worlds away from the penthouse she'd once called home. Grace, she said finally. I'm naming her Grace. There was a long silence on the line, and when Ethan finally spoke again, his voice had broken completely. That's a good name. I have to go, Ethan. Olivia, wait, But the line had already gone quiet, disconnected on his end by whatever system managed federal detention phone calls, and Olivia sat alone in the fading evening light, hand pressed against her stomach, tears finally slowing, feeling for the first time in over a year, the strange, hollow sensation of a chapter finally completely closing. She had no idea sitting there in that quiet, borrowed house that the closure she felt was premature, because 11 miles away in a federal holding facility processing new arrivals, a very different conversation was unfolding, one that would ensure this story was nowhere near finished. Ethan Caldwell sat across a small table from his lead defense attorney, a man named David Reiner, who had represented white-collar clients for over 20 years, and had learned in that time exactly how these conversations tended to go, once a client fully understood the scope of exposure they were facing. The federal prosecutor's office has made an initial approach, Reiner said quietly, sliding a folder across the table. They want Delacroix, all of him, every entity, every partner, every transaction going back to the beginning. If you cooperate fully, testify against Whitfield, and provide everything you know about Delacroix's network, they're prepared to discuss a significantly reduced sentence. Ethan stared at the folder without opening it. And if I don't cooperate, then you're looking at the maximum on every count they can make stick, and given the scope of what's in that drive, that's not a short sentence, Ethan. That's the rest of your daughter's childhood, possibly more. Ethan thought about Olivia's voice on the phone, still carrying the ache of everything he'd broken. Thought about the name she'd chosen for their daughter, a name that felt in a way he couldn't fully articulate, like a small, quiet act of forgiveness he hadn't earned and probably never would. There's something you should know before I decide, Ethan said slowly, and I need you to understand exactly what I'm about to tell you, because once I say it out loud, we can't take it back. Reiner set down his pen. Go ahead. Delacroix's operation isn't just money laundering. Ethan's voice dropped lower, the particular quiet of a man finally deciding to stop protecting people who had never once protected him. There's a second ledger, one I only discovered 8 months ago, buried inside the same offshore structure. It's not just financial crime, David. There are payments in there connected to something much worse than fraud, something involving people I don't think the federal government has any idea exists yet. Reiner went very still. What kind of payments? Ethan looked up, and for the first time since his arrest, something in his expression hardened into a version of the man he used to be, the version who had once built an empire from nothing through sheer relentless will, except now that will was aimed at something entirely different than ambition, the kind that could take down a lot more than just Marcus Delacroix, Ethan said quietly. If I give the prosecutors what I actually know, this isn't going to stay a financial crimes case. It's going to become something federal agents 3 levels above the people currently working it are going to want complete control over. And once that happens, David, I need you to understand something very clearly. What? Olivia isn't safe just because Delacroix's network gets exposed. She's the one who started pulling this thread in the first place. Whoever's on the other end of that second ledger is going to want to know exactly who found it and exactly how much they know. Reiner sat back slowly, the full weight of what Ethan was describing settling over the small room, and for the first time in his 20-year career handling white-collar defendants, he felt something that had nothing to do with legal strategy and everything to do with genuine personal alarm. Ethan, he said carefully, I need you to tell me everything, right now, before you say another word to anyone else. And 11 miles away, in a quiet suburban safe house, Olivia Brooks Caldwell finally allowed herself to fall asleep for the first time in nearly a week, believing wrongly that the most dangerous chapter of this entire ordeal had already ended with absolutely no idea that her husband was at that exact moment about to reveal a secret that would place her directly back in the path of danger far greater than anything Marcus Delacroix's people had ever intended for her. David Reiner did not sleep that night. He sat in his car outside the federal detention facility for nearly 40 minutes after leaving Ethan replaying every word of that conversation before finally calling a colleague he trusted more than almost anyone else in his professional life, a former federal prosecutor now working white-collar defense who had 12 years earlier handled a case that touched tangentially on exactly the kind of danger Ethan had just described. I need to ask you something hypothetically, Reiner said, pacing outside his car in the empty parking lot, voice low even though there was no one within 100 feet to overhear him. If a client discovered evidence connecting a financial crimes case to payments made to sitting judges and possibly to law enforcement officials, what would you do with that information? There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I'd tell you to be very, very careful who you say that sentence to next, his colleague finally said, because if you're right, this isn't a defense strategy conversation anymore. This is a conversation about whether you and your client are both about to become targets. Reiner closed his eyes, feeling the weight of that settle over him. That's what I was afraid of. By 9 the next morning, Reiner had arranged through channels far more careful than a simple phone call, a meeting between Ethan and the U.S. Attorney's Office that included notably an agent from a division neither of them had encountered before, a quiet, unassuming man named Robert Chen, who introduced himself only as being with the Department of Justice's Public Integrity Section, a phrase that made Reiner's stomach drop the moment he heard it, because public integrity investigators didn't get pulled into ordinary fraud cases. They got pulled in when fraud cases started touching people who wore robes or badges. Mr. Caldwell, Chen said, sliding a legal pad across the table, his voice calm in a way that felt almost more unsettling than urgency would have. I understand you have information about a secondary financial structure connected to the Delacroix network. I need you to walk me through everything you know in as much detail as you can provide, starting from the beginning. Ethan looked at Reiner, who gave him a small, tight nod, and began. 8 months ago, I found a second set of records inside the same offshore architecture Delacroix used to move money through Meridian. I wasn't looking for it. I was trying to understand exactly how deep my own exposure went, going through everything myself late one night, because I didn't trust anyone else to know how bad it actually was. Ethan's hands folded on the table tightened slightly. There were payments. Regular recurring disguised as consulting fees and legal retainers, routed to accounts that traced back eventually to 2 sitting judges in the Southern District and at least 1 senior official inside a federal regulatory agency. Chen didn't react visibly, but he wrote something down slowly, deliberately. Do you have documentation of this? I copied what I could before I lost access to the system. It's limited. Delacroix's people locked me out of the deeper files about 6 months ago, right around the time I stopped being useful to them and started being a liability instead. Ethan exhaled slowly. But what I have is enough to prove the payments existed. It's not enough on its own to prove what they were for. What do you believe they were for? Ethan was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper, the particular quiet of a man finally admitting something he had spent months trying not to fully understand himself. I believe they were for making certain cases disappear before they ever reached trial, he said. I believe Delacroix has been operating for years with the confidence of a man who knows exactly which cases will get quietly dismissed and which prosecutors will suddenly find themselves reassigned before they can build anything solid. I think that's part of why he was never worried about people like me eventually talking. Because in his mind, it never mattered what we said. He already owned the people who'd be deciding what happened next. The room went completely silent. Agent Chen closed his legal pad slowly. Mr. Caldwell, I need you to understand something very clearly. What you've just described, if it's accurate, represents a level of corruption that goes far beyond anything currently charged in this case. It also means that from this moment forward, you, your legal team, and anyone connected to the original evidence against Delacroix are potentially in significantly greater danger than any of us initially assessed. I know, Ethan said quietly. That's exactly why I needed to tell you before I told anyone else, because the person who's actually in the most danger right now isn't me. I'm already in federal custody. I'm surrounded by guards 24 hours a day. He looked up, and something in his expression, exhausted, frightened, but underneath it all, genuinely urgent, made even the composed Agent Chen lean forward slightly. It's Olivia. She's the one who started pulling this thread 18 months ago. If Delacroix's people figure out how deep her involvement actually goes, if they figure out she's the reason any of this came to light in the first place, she's not just a loose end to them anymore. She becomes the single greatest threat to an operation that's been protected for years. 3 miles away in the quiet suburban safe house that had felt 12 hours earlier, like the closing of a difficult chapter, Sarah Mitchell arrived at 8:15 that morning with an expression Olivia had learned over the past 2 weeks to recognize immediately as bad news. "We need to talk," Sarah said, and Olivia felt her stomach drop before a single additional word was spoken. "What happened?" Sarah sat down across from her at the small kitchen table, choosing her words with visible care. Ethan gave the federal prosecutors information this morning about a second set of financial records tied to the Delacroix network, records suggesting payments to judicial and regulatory officials. Olivia's hand went instinctively to her stomach, a gesture that had become almost involuntary over the past 2 weeks, a physical need to protect the one part of this entire nightmare that remained completely innocent. What does that mean for me? It means this case just got significantly bigger and significantly more dangerous, and it means the people connected to Delacroix now have a much stronger motive to make sure nobody who helped expose this network is ever in a position to testify about what they know. Sarah reached across the table and, in a gesture that surprised them both, took Olivia's hand. "I want to be completely honest with you, because you deserve that after everything you've done. The department is going to recommend you enter formal witness protection. Immediately. Today." Olivia sat very still, absorbing the words, slowly feeling the walls of the small kitchen seem to close in around her. Witness protection. You mean disappear. New name, new identity, no contact with anyone from my old life ever again. I mean staying alive long enough to raise your daughter, Sarah said gently but firmly. Olivia, I've seen what happens when people underestimate networks like this one. I'm not going to let that happen to you or to Grace. I have 35 weeks. I'm due in 5 weeks. You're telling me I need to disappear into an entirely new identity while I'm about to give birth. I'm telling you that the alternative is significantly worse, and I think you already know that. Olivia closed her eyes, feeling tears she had promised herself she wouldn't cry anymore, threatening at the corners, regardless the particular exhaustion of a woman who had spent 18 months being strong, being strategic, being 3 steps ahead of every danger, finally reaching a moment where the danger had grown too large for even her careful planning to fully contain. "What about Grace?" she asked quietly. "Is she in the same danger?" "Greater, potentially. She's the one with direct access to the actual documents. We're moving her into protective custody within the hour." "And Vanessa?" Sarah hesitated just slightly. "She's cooperating fully with investigators. There's no direct evidence she's aware of the deeper corruption, but out of caution, agents are reaching out to her this morning as well." Olivia sat with all of it for a long moment, the full architecture of danger she had spent 18 months building toward finally revealing itself in its true, terrifying scope. She had known somewhere in the back of her mind that Delacroix represented real danger. She had not fully allowed herself to understand until this exact moment, sitting in a quiet kitchen with a detective holding her hand, that the danger extended into rooms of power she had never imagined touching. Judges and regulators who existed in her mind as symbols of the very system she'd been trying to protect by exposing Ethan in the first place. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Olivia, I don't think you have time. Agents are prepared to move you within hours, not days. I know that's not fair, given everything you've already sacrificed, but just a few minutes, Sarah. Please. I need to call someone before I disappear into a version of my life where I might never be able to call anyone from before again." Sarah studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. 5 minutes. I'll be right outside." Alone in the small kitchen, Olivia pulled out her phone with trembling hands and dialed a number she hadn't called in 18 months, since before any of this had begun, since before she'd started documenting transactions and recruiting Grace and quietly dismantling her old life piece by careful piece. Her sister answered on the 3rd ring, groggy with sleep, confused by the unfamiliar number. "Hello? Rachel?" Olivia said, her voice breaking slightly for the first time in days. "It's me." There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. Rachel and Olivia had not spoken in nearly 2 years, a rift that had started small, a disagreement about a family holiday, and grown slowly into the kind of distance that felt too large to ever properly repair, made worse by Ethan's subtle, persistent discouragement of Olivia's remaining family relationships over the years. A pattern Olivia had only fully recognized as isolation tactics once she'd started researching. Months later, what coercive control actually looked like from the inside. "Olivia, oh my God, I've seen the news. I've been trying to call you for weeks. Are you okay? Are you safe? Where have you been?" "I don't have much time," Olivia said, cutting through the flood of questions gently but urgently. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to really hear it, because I might not be able to call you again for a long time, maybe ever." "What do you mean ever, Olivia? You're scaring me." "I love you," Olivia said, tears finally falling freely now. "I know things got difficult between us, and I know a lot of that was my fault, or at least my failure to see clearly what was happening in my own marriage while it was pulling me away from everyone who actually loved me. I'm sorry for the distance. I'm sorry I let it happen." "Olivia, please just tell me what's going on." "I'm going to have to disappear for a while," Olivia said quietly, "for my safety and for the babies. I can't tell you where or for how long, and I need you to understand that if you don't hear from me for a long time, it doesn't mean I don't love you. It means I'm trying to survive long enough to see my daughter grow up." Rachel was crying now, too, the sound raw and immediate through the phone. "Is there anything I can do? Anything at all?" Olivia closed her eyes, picturing her sister's face for the first time in months, feeling the particular grief of a goodbye that might, despite everyone's best intentions, turn out to be permanent. "Just remember me the way I actually was, not the way the tabloids are going to describe me, not the wife of a disgraced billionaire, not a headline. Just your sister who made a really difficult choice because it was the right one, even though it cost her almost everything. I'll never forget you, Liv. Never. I love you, Rachel. Take care of yourself." She ended the call before her sister could respond, before the sound of Rachel's crying could break the fragile composure she needed to hold together for whatever came next, and sat alone in the quiet kitchen for exactly the 5 minutes Sarah had given her, feeling the full, crushing weight of everything she was about to lose settle over her like something physical. When Sarah returned, Olivia was standing by the window, one hand resting on her stomach, her face composed again, the careful, controlled expression that had carried her through 18 months of quiet, dangerous planning. "I'm ready," she said simply. But 3 hours later, in a development nobody had fully anticipated, the plan changed entirely. Grace Lynn never made it to protective custody. The transport team assigned to move her from the initial safe house to a more secure federal facility arrived at the scheduled pickup time to find the house empty, the back door forced open, no signs of a struggle, severe enough to indicate violence, but no signs of Grace either. Her phone left behind on the kitchen counter, still charging exactly the kind of detail that meant either an extremely careful abduction or an extremely frightened woman who had decided in a moment of panic that running alone was safer than trusting a system that had already failed to protect her once. Sarah received the news while she and Olivia were still 40 minutes from the new secure location and made the difficult decision to tell Olivia immediately rather than wait, because Olivia deserved to know, and because there was a real possibility that whatever had happened to Grace could be connected to information that might put Olivia in more immediate danger than anyone had realized. Olivia went completely white when Sarah told her, gripping the car door handle so tightly her knuckles turned pale. "You said she'd be safe. You promised she'd be moved within the hour." "There was a scheduling delay, 40 minutes, that's all it took." Sarah's voice was tight with barely controlled fury at her own department's failure at a system that had let a critical window of vulnerability open even briefly. "I'm not going to lie to you, Olivia. This is serious. We don't know yet if she ran or if she was taken." "If she ran," Olivia said slowly, working through the possibilities with the same careful logic she'd applied to every decision of the past year. "Where would she go? She doesn't have family in the city. She doesn't have anywhere safe." "That's what worries me." Olivia's phone buzzed unexpectedly, an incoming call from an unknown number, and both women froze, staring at the screen for a long suspended moment before Olivia finally answered, putting it on speaker with shaking hands. "Hello." "Olivia, it's me!" Grace's voice breathless, terrified but alive. "I only have a minute. I saw 2 men outside the house before the transport team arrived. I recognized one of them from the day someone broke into my apartment. I panicked. I ran before they could get inside." Relief flooded through Olivia so intensely her knees nearly buckled. "Grace, where are you? Sarah's right here. We can send someone." "No police radios, no phones that can be traced. That's the only reason I'm calling from a payphone right now, instead of hiding somewhere completely silent." Grace's voice was shaking badly. "I need you to listen to me very carefully because I don't have much time before I need to move again. I still have a copy, a third copy that nobody knows about, not even you. I made it the same week I made the one in the safety deposit box, because some part of me never fully trusted that any system, not the police, not the FBI, not anyone, would actually protect us the way they promised." "Grace, where is it?" "I can't tell you over an open line. But I need you to know it exists, because if something happens to me before I can get it to the right people, I need someone else to know where to look." I hit a note. "Somewhere you'd understand, somewhere only you would think to check." "Grace, please just tell me." "The birds," Grace said quickly, her voice dropping even lower. "Think about the birds, Olivia. I have to go. I'm sorry. I'll call again when I can." The line went dead. Olivia sat frozen, staring at the phone, Sarah watching her with sharp, focused attention. What did she mean, the birds? Olivia's mind raced backward through months of careful planning, through conversations with Grace over diner coffee and encrypted messages sent late at night, searching for the specific meaning buried in that single cryptic phrase, and slowly, with a jolt that ran through her entire body, she understood. "The nursery," she said quietly. "The birds painted on the nursery ceiling. In the penthouse. I painted them myself, and Grace helped me one weekend when Ethan was traveling. We spent an entire Saturday up on ladders together, and I told her then, half joking, that if anything ever happened to either of us, that room was the one place in the entire apartment nobody would think to search carefully, because it was just a nursery, just paint and sentiment, nothing anyone would connect to evidence. Sarah was already reaching for her radio. "You're telling me there's a third copy of critical evidence hidden inside your former penthouse?" "I'm telling you there might be," Olivia said. "And if Grace hid it there before she disappeared, and if Delacroix's people figure out what that phrase means before we do, they're going to tear that entire apartment apart looking for it, and the birds are the last place anyone would think to check, except the two of us." Sarah was already issuing instructions into her radio, requesting an emergency search team be dispatched to the Caldwell penthouse, immediately requesting it be treated as an active evidence recovery operation rather than a routine search. Her voice tight with the particular urgency of someone racing against a clock nobody could accurately measure. "How fast can they get there?" Olivia asked. 15 minutes if traffic cooperates." It wasn't fast enough. When the search team arrived at the penthouse 18 minutes later, they found the front door already unlocked, though not forced, a detail that troubled Sarah deeply when she received the report over the radio, because an unlocked door meant someone had either used a key or had access to the building's master systems, the same kind of access that had erased 6 hours of security footage on the night Olivia originally disappeared. Inside the apartment had been searched methodically, room by room, drawers, pulled open furniture, moved, but nothing obviously stolen. Nothing violently destroyed, the particular controlled chaos of professionals looking for something specific, rather than opportunistic thieves looking for anything valuable. The nursery door stood open, and on the floor beneath the small hand-painted birds along the ceiling, molding a section of crown. Molding had been carefully pried away, revealing a narrow, hollow space behind it. Empty now, nothing left inside except a thin layer of dust, disturbed recently enough to show clear fingerprints in the shape of fingers that had reached in and removed something small. They had beaten the search team there by less than an hour. Sarah received this news while still driving Olivia beside her in the passenger seat, and watched Olivia's face crumble as she processed what it meant. Whoever was working for Delacroix had already decoded Grace's cryptic message, or had somehow discovered the hiding place independently, and had retrieved whatever evidence Grace had hidden there before federal agents could secure it. "They have it," Olivia whispered. "Whatever Grace hid, they have it now." "We don't know that for certain. It's possible Grace already retrieved it herself before calling you. She wouldn't have hidden it and then called to tell me where it was if she'd already taken it herself. That doesn't make sense." Olivia pressed both hands against her face, feeling the entire careful architecture of her plan, built with such precision over 18 months, suddenly feeling fragile and exposed in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. "This is my fault. I told Grace about that hiding place. I gave her the idea. If something happens to her because of that..." "Olivia, stop." Sarah's voice was firm, cutting through the spiral before it could fully take hold. "You didn't create Marcus Delacroix. You didn't create a system corrupt enough to require this kind of careful, dangerous evidence gathering in the first place. You made the best decisions you could with the information you had at every single step, and you are not responsible for the actions of criminals who are choosing right now to threaten and pursue innocent people. That responsibility belongs entirely to them." Olivia didn't respond, staring out the window at the city passing by, feeling the particular exhaustion of a woman who had spent 18 months being strong enough for everyone around her, finally reaching the edge of how much longer she could keep doing it. They arrived at the new secure federal facility just after 2 that afternoon, a nondescript building with no signage, heavy security, and the particular sterile quiet of a place designed to keep people safely invisible. Olivia was photographed, given a temporary identity she would use for the foreseeable future, and settled into a small, comfortable but distinctly institutional room that would serve as her home for however long it took federal authorities to determine the network was fully contained. She had been there less than 2 hours when Agent Chen requested a meeting, arriving with Sarah and a stack of files that made Olivia's stomach tighten with anticipation before a single word was spoken. "We've had a development," Chen said, sitting across from her. Grace Lynn was located approximately 90 minutes ago. Olivia sat up straight. Is she okay? She's alive. She made contact with local police in a small town about 2 hours outside the city, requesting protection after noticing what she believed was surveillance on the bus she'd taken to get there. She's currently being transported to a secure facility. Relief washed through Olivia so completely, her eyes filled with tears again. Thank God. There's more. Chen continued, his expression carefully neutral, in a way that made Olivia brace herself instinctively. Grace confirmed she did hide a copy of key documentation at the location. You identified the same location that was found compromised. She also confirmed she does not believe she was the one who retrieved it. So Delacroix's people have it. We believe so, yes. Chen slid a folder across the table. Which brings me to why I wanted to speak with you directly, rather than simply informing you through Detective Mitchell. Ethan's cooperation, combined with what we already had from the safety deposit box, combined with what Grace has continued to provide from memory, gives us substantial documentation of the core Delacroix network and its connections to Whitfield. What we don't have anymore, what was in that hidden copy specifically, was detailed documentation connecting the network to the judicial and regulatory payments Ethan described. Names, specific transaction dates, the exact evidence needed to prosecute officials rather than simply financial criminals. Olivia absorbed this slowly. So they got exactly the piece that would have exposed the most powerful people involved. That appears to be the case, yes. What does that mean for the investigation? Chen was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. It means the case against Delacroix and Whitfield for financial crimes remains strong. Overwhelming, even given everything else we've gathered. But the deeper corruption, Ethan described the judicial payments, the regulatory protection, that thread may now be significantly harder to prove without additional evidence. So they win. The people who matter most, the ones with real power, they just walk away clean, and only the financial crimes stick. I didn't say that, Chen said carefully. I said it's harder, not impossible. Investigations like this take time. Olivia, sometimes years, and evidence has a way of surfacing, eventually, particularly once people inside a compromised network start to feel the walls closing in and begin protecting themselves instead of each other. Whitfield is going to be arrested within days on the financial charges we can already prove. Once he understands the full scope of what we know, once he understands that Delacroix's people just retrieved evidence that could have implicated others while leaving him exposed, we believe there's a strong possibility he chooses cooperation over loyalty. Olivia sat with that for a long moment, feeling the particular complicated exhaustion of a woman who had sacrificed nearly everything toward a goal that now felt for the first time genuinely uncertain. And in the meantime, while we wait for Whitfield to decide whether loyalty or self-preservation matters more to him, Grace and I just stay hidden indefinitely, hoping the people who are willing to break into apartments and penthouses looking for evidence eventually give up and move on. In the meantime, Chen said, his voice gentler now, you stay protected and safe and focused on the fact that despite everything, you and Grace have already accomplished something extraordinary. Two women with no law enforcement background, no institutional power, took down one of the largest financial fraud operations this office has investigated in over a decade and exposed a corruption network that federal authorities didn't even know existed 3 weeks ago. That matters, Olivia, even if the full picture takes longer than any of us would like to complete. Olivia nodded slowly, though the words offered only partial comfort against the very real fear still sitting heavy in her chest. She thought of her daughter, 35 weeks along now, due in a matter of weeks, and felt the particular terror of a woman who had spent so long fighting for something larger than herself, finally confronting how much personal danger that fight might still cost her, right at the moment she needed to be safest. That evening, alone in the small institutional room that would serve as her home for the foreseeable future, Olivia's phone, the secure one issued by federal marshals, buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number, and her entire body went cold before she even opened it. We know who you are. We know what you did. Enjoy your daughter while you can. She stared at the message for a long, frozen moment before her hands finally moved, forwarding it immediately to Sarah, who called within 90 seconds, her voice sharp with alarm. How did they get this number? This phone was issued 4 hours ago, Olivia. Nobody outside this facility should have any way to reach it. I don't know, Olivia whispered, her whole body trembling now, one hand pressed hard against her stomach, as if she could somehow shield her daughter from a threat delivered through a screen. Sarah, if they can reach me here, if they already know this number, what does that mean? Is someone inside your own department feeding them information? The silence on the other end of the line lasted just a beat too long, and in that silence Olivia understood with a dread that settled deep and permanent in her chest that Sarah was thinking exactly the same terrifying thought. "I'm coming to you right now," Sarah said finally, her voice tight with controlled urgency. "Don't leave that room. Don't open the door for anyone except me personally in person. Do you understand? Sarah, if someone inside the department is compromised, how do I know that person isn't you?" There was another pause, and when Sarah spoke again, her voice carried something raw and honest that cut through Olivia's spiraling fear. "You don't. Not completely. I understand why you'd wonder that, and I don't blame you for asking. All I can tell you is that I have spent 2 weeks watching you sacrifice everything to do the right thing, and I am not going to be the reason that sacrifice gets you killed. I'm 15 minutes out. Stay exactly where you are." Olivia sat alone in that small room for the longest 15 minutes of her entire life, one hand on her stomach, feeling her daughter's small, insistent movements beneath her palm. The only proof in that terrifying stretch of silence that some part of her world remained untouched by everything crashing down around her. When Sarah finally arrived, flanked by 2 additional agents, Olivia didn't recognize. Her expression was grim in a way that told Olivia the danger had not passed, had perhaps only just begun. "We're moving you again," Sarah said without preamble. "Tonight. Somewhere even I won't have advanced knowledge of the location to eliminate any possibility of information leaking through normal channels. What about Grace? Same protocol, separate location." Olivia felt tears gathering, exhaustion and fear tangled together into something she could no longer hold back. "How long, Sarah? How long am I going to have to keep running? I'm 35 weeks pregnant. I'm supposed to be nesting right now, preparing a nursery, resting, not fleeing to unknown locations, because someone inside your own department might be feeding information to criminals." Sarah crossed the room and knelt in front of Olivia's chair, taking both of her hands, her expression fierce and completely sincere. "I don't know how long. I wish I could tell you it ends tomorrow or next week or even next month. What I can tell you is that I am not leaving your side until this is over. Not tonight, not next week, not for as long as it takes. You didn't just stumble into this danger, Olivia. You walked into it deliberately at enormous personal cost because you believed protecting the truth mattered more than protecting yourself. I'm not going to let that courage get erased by whoever sent that message tonight." Olivia held onto Sarah's hands, grounding herself in the fierce, unwavering certainty in the detective's voice, and slowly the worst of the panic began to recede, replaced by the same steady, determined resolve that had carried her through 18 months of careful, dangerous planning. "Okay," she said quietly. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere safe. I promise you that much, even if I can't promise you the specifics yet." They left the facility 20 minutes later, moving through back corridors and unmarked vehicles, with the particular careful precision of people who understood now that the dangers surrounding this case had grown far larger and far more sophisticated than anyone had initially anticipated. Olivia sat in the back of an unmarked car, watching the city lights blur past the window, one hand resting protectively on her stomach, and thought, with a clarity that surprised her even in the middle of genuine fear, that she would do every single part of this, again exactly the same way, if it meant her daughter grew up in a world with slightly less corruption in it than the one Olivia had discovered hiding beneath her own marriage. But as the car pulled onto the highway, merging into late evening traffic, Olivia's phone buzzed one final time, the same unknown number as before, a message that would ensure this story's most dangerous chapter was only just beginning to unfold. "We found your sister's address, too." Olivia stared at the message until the words blurred her thumb, hovering over the screen, the phone trembling in her hand, hard enough that Sarah noticed immediately from the front seat. "What is it?" Olivia turned the screen around wordlessly, and Sarah's expression hardened into something Olivia had never seen on the detective's face before, a controlled fury that radiated off her in waves as she snatched the phone, read the message twice, and immediately barked an address into her radio. "I need units to Rachel Brooks's residence right now. Possible imminent threat. Move." "Sarah, if they know where my sister lives." Olivia's voice cracked completely, the careful composure she had maintained through 18 months of danger finally shattering under the weight of a threat aimed not at herself, but at someone she loved, who had absolutely nothing to do with any of this. "She has 2 kids, Sarah. She has a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old. If something happens to her because of me, nothing is going to happen to her." Sarah's voice was iron absolute, the voice of a woman who had decided somewhere in the last 10 minutes that she would burn her entire career down before she let this case claim another innocent life. "I have officers 5 minutes from her house. She's going to be fine." Those 5 minutes felt like 5 hours. Olivia sat in the back of the unmarked car, one hand locked around her stomach, the other gripping the door handle so tightly her knuckles had gone white, replaying every moment of her earlier phone call to Rachel, every word searching desperately for any detail that might have given away her sister's location to someone monitoring the call. Then it hit her, a cold, sickening realization that made her stomach drop entirely. "They didn't need to trace the call," she said slowly. "They already had access to information about my family before any of this started. If they've been inside Caldwell International's systems, if Marcus Delacroix has had eyes on Ethan's life for years, the way it sounds like he has, Rachel's address was probably in some file somewhere long before I ever called her." Sarah didn't respond, focused entirely on the radio, on the voices of officers approaching Rachel's house, and the silence in that car stretched so long and so taut that Olivia thought she might genuinely be sick from the fear alone. Then finally, a voice crackled through the radio. "Units on scene. House is secure. Ms. Brooks and both children are safe. No signs of forced entry, no signs of surveillance on the property currently." Olivia exhaled a breath she felt like she'd been holding for an entire year, tears spilling over freely. Now relief so total, it left her shaking. "Thank God, thank God." "We're going to move her too," Sarah said, already dialing a number, coordinating with a speed and precision that spoke to exactly how seriously she was taking this threat now. "Protective custody, at least temporarily, until we understand exactly what we're dealing with. She's going to be terrified." "She's going to be alive," Sarah said simply, and Olivia had no argument for that. Rachel was moved within the hour, her children pulled from school under police escort, in a scene that would later require careful, gentle explanations. Neither 6-year-olds nor 9-year-olds should ever have had to hear explanations about why they suddenly couldn't go home, why police officers were now a constant presence in their lives, why their mother's face had taken on an expression of controlled terror that no amount of reassurance fully erased. Olivia learned all of this secondhand from her new secure location, unable to see her sister or her nephews in person, for fear of creating a traceable connection between them, and the guilt of it sat in her chest like a physical weight, heavy and unmovable, no matter how many times Sarah reminded her that none of this was her fault. "I did this," Olivia said quietly, sitting across from Sarah in yet another unfamiliar room. This one somewhere she wasn't even entirely certain of the city, the particular disorientation of a life now defined entirely by secure transports and unmarked vehicles and rooms designed to keep her invisible. "I pulled Rachel into this. I pulled her kids into this. 2 innocent children are sleeping somewhere unfamiliar tonight because their aunt decided to expose a billion-dollar fraud." "You pulled a corrupt husband's crimes into the light," Sarah corrected firmly. "The danger to your family exists because men like Marcus Delacroix decided a long time ago that threatening children was an acceptable business tactic. That's not on you, Olivia. That responsibility belongs entirely to the people making those threats." Olivia wanted desperately to believe that completely, and some rational part of her did the same part that had carried her through 18 months of dangerous, careful planning with total conviction that she was doing the right thing. But another part of her, the part that had grown up believing family, came before everything sat awake that night, unable to fully separate her own choices from the danger now surrounding people who had never asked to be part of any of this. 3 days passed in a strange, suspended tension. Olivia moved once more to yet another location, growing accustomed to a life defined by careful routine and constant vigilance. Federal agents checking in twice daily updates on the investigation, arriving in careful, measured pieces designed to keep her informed, without overwhelming a woman now 35 weeks pregnant with information her body and mind could barely process alongside everything else. Then, on the 4th day, everything changed again. Charles Whitfield was arrested at 6 in the morning, federal agents arriving at his Connecticut estate with a warrant that named him in 12 separate counts of securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy, the same charges that had already been filed against Ethan weeks earlier. Evidence of his involvement in the Delacroix network now overwhelming enough that even his considerable legal resources couldn't delay the inevitable. Sarah brought Olivia the news personally, along with something that made the tension in Olivia's chest ease just slightly for the first time in days. Whitfield's lawyers reached out within 4 hours of his arrest, Sarah said, sitting across from her with something almost like cautious optimism in her expression. He wants to talk. Full cooperation in exchange for a plea agreement. Agent Chen believes, given the scope of what Whitfield likely knows, after decades of involvement with Delacroix's operation, this could be the break they need to finally build the case connecting the network to judicial and regulatory corruption. Olivia sat forward slightly, something in her chest tight and anxious for days loosening just a fraction. You mean the evidence Grace's hidden copy was supposed to provide? Potentially better than that even. Documents can be stolen or destroyed. A cooperating witness with decades of first-hand knowledge is much harder for Delacroix's people to make disappear, especially once he's already in federal custody, surrounded by the same level of security your husband is under. Do you trust him, Whitfield? Sarah considered the question carefully. I don't trust men like Charles Whitfield on principle, but I trust self-preservation as a motivator, and right now self-preservation is telling him that cooperation is his only path to seeing daylight again before he's an old man. That kind of motivation tends to produce fairly reliable testimony. Olivia absorbed this slowly, feeling something shift inside her that she hadn't expected, a small, cautious flicker of hope after days of feeling like the danger surrounding her only continued expanding with no end in sight. If Whitfield cooperates fully, if he gives them what they need to build the corruption case, does that mean this actually ends? Does that mean Delacroix's people stop having any reason to come after Grace or me or my family? It means the case against them gets significantly stronger, and once these networks start collapsing, once enough people are cooperating, and enough evidence is secured, the incentive for violence against witnesses actually decreases rather than increases. Killing witnesses only makes sense if it prevents evidence from reaching prosecutors. Once the evidence is already secured through multiple independent sources, silencing any one person stops accomplishing anything. Sarah's expression softened slightly. I'm not going to promise you this ends tomorrow, but I think for the first time since this case started, we're finally looking at the beginning of the end instead of just more danger. That cautious hope carried Olivia through the following week, a week defined by small, incremental progress, reported carefully by Sarah and Agent Chen Whitfield's testimony, proving even more valuable than initially hoped corroborating details from the stolen documents that Delacroix's people had assumed wrongly would leave prosecutors without a path forward. Grace moved to yet another secure location after the scare at the original safe house, called Olivia twice during that week, her voice growing steadily less frightened with each conversation, the particular resilience of a woman who had spent months preparing herself mentally and emotionally for exactly this kind of danger, finally allowing herself to believe she might actually survive it. I keep thinking about that day at the diner, Grace said during their second call, her voice carrying something wistful now beneath the exhaustion. When you first showed me those transaction records, I remember thinking you were either the bravest person I'd ever met or completely out of your mind asking a stranger from your husband's finance department to help you bring down his entire company. Which do you think it was? Olivia asked, a small, genuine smile finding its way onto her face for the first time in what felt like weeks. Honestly, probably both. Grace laughed, the sound lighter than Olivia had heard from her in a long time. But I'm glad you asked me. Even with everything that's happened, even with almost getting caught twice, I'm glad I said yes. Why? Grace was quiet for a moment before answering. Because I spent 2 years in that finance department watching things I knew were wrong happen right in front of me and telling myself it wasn't my problem, that speaking up would just cost me my job and change nothing. You were the first person who ever showed me that one person, even someone without power, even someone everyone assumes is too small to matter, can actually change something if they're brave enough and patient enough and careful enough. I needed that. I think a lot of people need that, honestly. Yee! Olivia held on to those words through the difficult days that followed, through the particular loneliness of late pregnancy spent in hiding, unable to properly prepare a nursery, unable to see her sister or her nephews, unable to do anything except wait and trust a system she had spent 18 months learning not to fully trust. At 37 weeks, exactly 9 days before her due date, Sarah arrived at Olivia's secure location with news that made Olivia's whole body go rigid with anticipation before a single word had been spoken. Marcus Delacroix was arrested this morning, Sarah said, and the relief in her voice was unmistakable, genuine months of tension finally beginning to release. Along with 4 of his primary associates, the judge and the regulatory official Ethan originally identified have both been placed on administrative leave pending investigation, and 2 additional officials Whitfield's testimony identified are currently under review as well. Olivia sat very still, absorbing news she had waited 18 months to hear, news that represented the successful completion of a plan she had built alone in secret at enormous personal risk over more than a year of careful patient work. "It's over," she said quietly, testing the words, uncertain whether she actually believed them yet. "The immediate danger is significantly reduced," Sarah said carefully, always precise, always honest, even when Olivia desperately wanted simple reassurance instead. "Delacroix's operation is dismantled. His key associates are in custody. Without the network's leadership, the remaining pieces don't have the coordination or the resources to continue targeting witnesses effectively. I won't tell you there's zero risk because that would be dishonest, but I can tell you that every threat assessment we've run in the past 48 hours shows dramatic improvement." Olivia felt tears gathering different this time than every other time she had cried throughout this entire ordeal. Not fear, not grief, but something closer to the particular release of a burden finally genuinely beginning to lift. "Can I go home?" she asked quietly. "Not the penthouse. I mean, can I stop hiding? Can Rachel go home? Can Grace stop looking over her shoulder every time she leaves a building?" "Soon," Sarah said. "Not today, not this week. There's still process, still transition, still some verification that needs to happen before we fully stand down protective measures. But soon, I promise you that." 6 days later, Olivia went into labor. She was in a modest, comfortable apartment federal marshals had arranged as a longer-term secure residence further from the city than the original safe houses, a place with an actual nursery. She had finally been allowed to begin preparing, though far more simply than the elaborate room she had painted with her own hands in the Manhattan penthouse that now felt like it belonged to an entirely different lifetime. The contraction started at just past 2 in the morning, mild at first, easy to dismiss as the same false alarms that had troubled her occasionally over the past few weeks. But by 4, they had grown close enough together, sharp enough, that Olivia understood with the same clear-headed certainty that had carried her through every other major decision of this entire ordeal that this was real. Sarah, who had insisted on staying nearby during these final weeks, despite the case technically having wound down enough that her direct involvement was no longer strictly necessary, arrived within 15 minutes of Olivia's call, driving her personally to a hospital under an assumed name, security discreet but present. The particular strange combination of an ordinary universal human experience unfolding within the extraordinary careful architecture of witness protection. "You don't have to do this," Olivia said at one point, gripping Sarah's hand through a contraction sweat on her forehead. Exhaustion and pain and fear and something like joy all tangled together in ways she hadn't expected. "You've done so much already. This isn't your responsibility. I made you a promise," Sarah said simply, wiping Olivia's forehead with a damp cloth, her voice steady, despite the emotion clearly moving beneath it. That first night you called me terrified alone, I promised you I'd make sure your daughter was safe, no matter what happened. I intend to keep that promise for as long as it takes." Grace Sophia Caldwell was born at 11:47 that morning, 7 pounds 2 ounces with a full head of dark hair and a cry that filled the hospital room with a sound so purely simply alive that Olivia exhausted beyond anything she had ever experienced. Holding her daughter, for the first time felt every single moment of the past 18 months, every sleepless night, every careful lie, every terrifying phone call, every sacrifice finally completely worth it. "She's perfect," Sarah said softly, standing slightly back to give Olivia space, though the emotion on her own face was unmistakable. A woman who had spent weeks fighting fiercely to protect this exact moment, finally witnessing it arrive safely. "Grace," Olivia whispered, looking down at her daughter's face, thinking of the woman whose courage had helped make this entire fight possible, a woman who had risked everything alongside her, a stranger from a company holiday party who had become, over 18 months, one of the truest friends Olivia had ever had. "My Grace." The real Grace, the one whose name now belonged permanently to Olivia's daughter, called that same evening, her voice thick with emotion, when Olivia told her the news. "You named her after me," Grace said, disbelief and joy mixed together in her voice. "Of course I did," Olivia said, exhausted, but glowing, watching her daughter sleep in the small bassinet beside her hospital bed. "You risked your entire life for this baby before she was even born. She should carry your name. She should always know the story of the woman who helped make sure she'd grow up safe." "I'm going to spoil her rotten," Grace said, laughing through tears. "The moment it's safe for me to actually meet her in person, I'm going to spoil that child completely. I'm counting on it." Word of the birth reached Ethan 2 days later, delivered by David Reiner during a scheduled legal visit, and according to the guard who witnessed the moment the disgraced billionaire sitting in an orange jumpsuit in a federal detention facility surrounded by concrete walls that represented the total collapse of everything he had once built, wept openly for the first time since his arrest, learning that his daughter had been born safely healthy, named for a woman he had never met, but whose courage had ultimately helped save both his daughter's life. And in an ironic twist, neither Ethan nor Olivia could have fully anticipated 18 months earlier, potentially his own. Because 3 weeks after Grace's birth, in a development that surprised even Agent Chen, Ethan's continued cooperation, combined with additional details he provided about Delacroix's operation once the network's leadership was safely in custody, resulted in a plea agreement that reduced his potential sentence significantly from what had initially looked like decades to a range that, while still substantial, at minimum ensured he would eventually be released, while his daughter was still young enough to potentially know him as something other than a stranger she'd only heard about. Whether that mattered, whether Ethan Caldwell deserved any measure of leniency after everything he had done, after years of fraud that had genuinely harmed hundreds of investors, after the affair, after the isolation, after everything Olivia had endured because of choices he had made freely and repeatedly over years, was a question Olivia found herself turning over many times in the weeks that followed, holding her daughter, watching her sleep, wondering what version of a father Ethan might eventually become if he became anything at all. She didn't have an answer yet. She wasn't sure she would have one for years, possibly not until her daughter was old enough to ask her own questions, to want her own relationship with a father whose crimes she would eventually read about in news archives and court documents that would exist permanently, a part of the story she would someday need to understand in her own way, at her own pace. Vanessa Reed's cooperation with federal investigators, meanwhile, resulted in no criminal charges against her prosecutors, satisfied that she had genuinely been unaware of the deeper corruption Ethan had been involved in, though her public reputation never fully recovered from the scandal. She left New York 18 months later. According to a brief item Olivia noticed in an entertainment newsletter she still occasionally read, relocating to a smaller city building, a quieter, more modest career, occasionally posting reflective, thoughtful content about the dangers of building your entire identity around another person's approval content that read to anyone who had followed the full story like a woman genuinely painfully working to understand what she had allowed herself to become complicit in, even unknowingly. Olivia felt when she read those occasional updates something more complicated than simple anger, though anger had certainly been present for a long time. Mostly, she felt a kind of distant, weary recognition of another woman who had also, in her own way, been deceived by a man skilled at showing people exactly the version of himself they wanted to see until the truth finally broke through in ways too large to ignore. Marcus Delacroix's trial, when it finally began nearly a year after his arrest, became one of the most closely watched financial corruption cases in a decade, exposing not just the scope of his money laundering operation, but the disturbing depth of judicial and regulatory corruption that had protected it for years. 2 judges were ultimately removed from the bench. A senior regulatory official resigned in disgrace before formal charges could even be filed. Whitfield's cooperation proved instrumental throughout his testimony, providing the connective tissue between financial records and human decisions that transformed a complicated paper trail into a story a jury could actually follow and understand. Delacroix himself was ultimately convicted on all major counts, sentenced to what amounted to the remainder of his natural life, a resolution that brought Olivia a complicated mixture of relief and something that never quite resolved into simple satisfaction, because no verdict, however thorough, could fully undo the 18 months of fear she had lived through the danger her sister and nephews had been exposed to. The friendship with Grace, forged entirely under threat. The version of new motherhood she had experienced hidden away from ordinary life, unable to properly celebrate her daughter's birth with family gathered around her, the way she had once imagined years earlier, when she was simply a young wife dreaming about a future that looked nothing like the one she eventually lived. But there was relief too real and substantial, the particular relief of watching a system that had felt for so long hopelessly rigged against ordinary people ultimately produce something like genuine justice, slow and imperfect and costly but real nonetheless. 2 years after Grace's birth, Olivia sat on the porch of a modest house in a quiet town, whose name she still out of old habit was careful about mentioning to strangers, watching her daughter chase a butterfly across a small backyard, with the particular fierce, joyful concentration only very young children seem able to summon completely. Rachel sat beside her home now for over a year, the temporary danger to her family long since resolved, though Olivia suspected some residual caution would probably never fully disappear from how her sister approached the world, the particular permanent watchfulness that comes from once having believed, even briefly, that your children might be in genuine danger. "Do you ever think about him?" Rachel asked quietly, watching Grace tumble happily onto the grass, laughing at nothing in particular. "Ethan, I mean." Olivia considered the question with the same careful honesty she tried to bring to everything, now a habit that had only deepened since everything that happened. "Sometimes, less than I used to. He wrote to me, you know, from prison, a few times a year." "Do you write back?" "Sometimes. Short letters. I send him photos occasionally of Grace. I think he deserves to watch her grow up even from a distance, even through photographs instead of in person. I don't think withholding that would actually punish him the way some part of me once wanted to. I think it would just punish her eventually, taking away any chance she has to understand where half of who she is came from." "That's more generous than I'd manage, honestly." Olivia smiled slightly, watching her daughter now attempting with total seriousness to teach the butterfly some kind of dance. "It's not really about generosity. It's about the kind of mother I want to be. I want Grace to grow up understanding that people can make catastrophic mistakes and still be capable eventually of genuine remorse, genuine change. I want her to understand that love and accountability aren't opposites. You can hold someone fully responsible for what they did and still leave room for who they might eventually become if they're willing to actually do the work of becoming it." "And is he doing the work?" Olivia thought about Ethan's letters, careful, honest, in ways he had never quite managed to be during their marriage, describing therapy sessions inside the facility, financial literacy classes he had started teaching other inmates, a slow, ongoing process of genuinely reckoning with exactly how far he had drifted from the man he once believed himself to be. "I think so. she said finally. "I think prison stripped away everything that used to let him avoid looking at himself honestly. Money status, the ability to control how people perceived him. Without any of that, he's had to actually sit with who he became. And from what he's written, that's been harder for him than any of the legal consequences. Do you think you'll ever forgive him fully, I mean?" Olivia was quiet for a long moment, watching her daughter. Watching the particular golden late afternoon light settling over a yard, a house, a life she had built entirely on her own from nothing. Exactly the way Ethan himself had once built his empire, except built this time on honesty, instead of the careful, elaborate deceptions that had eventually destroyed everything he'd created. "I've forgiven him for the person he was when this all happened," she said slowly. "I don't carry that anger the way I used to, that constant, exhausting anger that used to sit in my chest every single day of the investigation. But forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting, and it isn't the same as pretending none of it happened. I think what I've actually found is something closer to peace. I made the right choice, even though it cost me almost everything. I built a good life out of the wreckage. My daughter is safe and healthy and loved beyond measure. By me, by you, by Grace, by so many people who showed up for us when it mattered most. That's not forgiveness exactly. It's something better. It's actually moving forward." That evening, after Rachel had gone home and Grace had finally reluctantly fallen asleep after an entire day spent chasing butterflies and laughing at nothing, Olivia sat alone on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sky shift slowly toward evening, thinking about the entire impossible arc of the past 3 years. She thought about the night she had discovered the first irregular transaction, sitting alone at Ethan's desk long after he'd fallen asleep. A small discrepancy that could have been explained a dozen innocent ways, and the quiet, cold certainty that had settled into her stomach even then, an instinct she almost hadn't trusted, almost hadn't followed. She thought about Grace Lynn at that first diner meeting, two strangers deciding over lukewarm coffee to risk everything for the same simple, stubborn belief that the truth mattered more than their own safety. She thought about Sarah Mitchell, a detective who had started this case suspecting Olivia of something dark and complicated, and had ended it as one of the fiercest protectors Olivia had ever known, staying by her side through labor, through fear, through every single dangerous turn this story had taken. She thought about the wedding ring she had left on that kitchen counter 3 years ago, now a decision made in the quiet, terrifying hours before dawn, uncertain at the time whether she was making the bravest choice of her entire life or the most reckless one. She understood now, sitting on this porch, watching the last light fade behind trees that belonged to a life entirely her own, that it had been both. Brave and reckless in exactly equal measure, the way most genuinely important decisions probably are the kind that require you to risk absolutely everything you have with no guarantee of the outcome, simply because staying silent had become impossible to live with. She had lost a marriage. She had lost the version of her life she'd once imagined, the elegant Manhattan penthouse, the predictable, comfortable future she had once believed she was building alongside a man she loved completely. But she had gained something she hadn't fully understood she was missing until she'd found it. Her own voice, her own strength, the absolute certainty that she was capable of protecting not just herself, but everyone she loved, and even people she had never met, hundreds of investors who would never know her name, ordinary people whose life savings had been protected because one quiet, underestimated woman had refused to stay silent when silence would have been so much easier. Inside the house, Grace stirred slightly in her sleep, and Olivia rose to check on her standing in the doorway of a small, simple nursery. Nothing like the elaborate room she had once painted with her own hands in a penthouse she would never see again, but warm and safe, and entirely, completely theirs. She watched her daughter sleep for a long moment, feeling the particular overwhelming love that had carried her through every impossible choice of the past 3 years, and understood with total clarity exactly what she wanted her daughter to eventually know about the story of how she came into this world. Not that her father had been a criminal, not that her mother had once been a headline in every newspaper in the country. Not even the full complicated details of federal investigations and offshore accounts and judges removed from the bench. She wanted her daughter to know simply that when her mother discovered the truth, she chose courage over comfort. She chose honesty over safety. She chose to protect people she had never met at enormous personal risk because she believed completely that some things mattered more than staying quiet. She wanted her daughter to grow up understanding that real strength rarely looks like anger or revenge or dramatic confrontation. Real strength, the kind that actually changes something, usually looks quiet, patient, careful, the kind of strength that spends 18 months documenting evidence in secret, that paints birds on a nursery ceiling while planning an exit strategy. Nobody suspects that befriends a stranger over diner coffee and builds brick by careful brick, an alliance strong enough to bring down an empire built on lies. Olivia Brooks Caldwell had once been the woman standing quietly beside a billionaire, overlooked, underestimated, assumed by everyone, including her own husband, to be simply background support, someone whose only role was to smile at galas and manage a household while a powerful man built something important. She had proven in the end to be the most powerful person in the entire story. Because empires built on lies eventually collapse under their own weight. Because the people we underestimate are often the ones capable of everything. Because a woman who has finally believed only in herself, who chooses to walk away from everything familiar rather than stay silent about everything wrong, does not simply survive. She rebuilds, completely, permanently, on her own terms. And this time, whatever she builds belongs entirely to her.